and welcome to ClapperCast. I'm your host as always, Carson Timar, and today I am joined once again by Nicolò Grasso and Mr. Editor-in-Chief Jak-Luke Sharp as we begin our string of looking at older releases to start off the year, starting with 2004's Bad Education. Somewhat based on Pedro Almodóvar's own life, the film offers the perspective of a young man who is a filmmaker who begins to think back to his life growing up in a church, not only a church where he was abused by a priest, but also where he found his first love. He begins to put these complex emotions into a film, and the film from there unravels slowly, revealing multiple twists and turns. The film is complex in its usage of representation and perspective, and today on the podcast, not only do we discuss our thoughts on Bad Education, but we also discuss a larger concept of Pedro Almodóvar as a filmmaker. We discuss what is special and what works within his filmography, and what hasn't really aged particularly well, while also asking the question of what is next for the filmmaker. As always, thank you so much for listening and watching the podcast. If you want video, there's a video option on YouTube. If you want just audio, it is available on most major podcast platforms. And with that, let's get to the episode. Enjoy our review for Pedro Almodóvar's Bad Education.
Por mi culpa.
Por tu culpa.
Hola, señor Berenguer.
Buenos días, padre Manolo. Ese hombre tiene una gran deuda conmigo. Y ha llegado el momento de que la pague. No me gusta verte así.
Esas cartas no son necesarias. Dámelas.
Cuando me entregues el dinero.
El padre Manolo.
Ya no soy padre ni de mi propio hijo.
Para cosas malas las dos juntas, pero para las buenas tú sola.
Okay, and Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you first to start our discussion on Pedro Almodóvar's Bad Education. What did you think of the film? I know you were pretty fired up, at least behind the scenes, about this one.
I'm excited. Anytime I get to talk about Pedro Almodóvar, which doesn't happen often, surprisingly, I'm very, very excited, especially since we're talking about one of his most popular films, but still not as popular as others. La Maleducación, Bad Education. I first watched it back in 2019. This beautiful, beautiful period. You were a young lad, Carson. You probably didn't know, but there was a magical time in life where Mubi would give free subscriptions to university students, and it was gold. And I lied and I said I was going to graduate in 2022 so that I could have the free subscription till 2022. Not even 2 months after I did that, they started charging students a discount fee. It was like, nice, I have free Mubi. And they were doing this whole retrospective because Pain and Glory had just come out in 2019. And so I watched a lot of his movies. Some of them, they kind of start to blur together after a while. I was looking back, I was like, I genuinely don't know, Dark Habits and What Have I Done to Deserve This? I don't know the difference between the two. I barely remember anything. But Bad Education, I remember clearly. And rewatching it, I almost forgot just how dense this film is. First of all, it's just... It's pure melodrama, as pretty much almost every Pedro Almodóvar movie is. He indulges a lot in sweeping music, big drama, people crying, strong emotions. There's murders, there's sex, there's betrayal, backstabbing. It's almost this twisted version of Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, where it's all about what's reality and what's fake, and the person who's another person, and their reincarnation, and they're coming back. It's very trippy. It's one of those movies that the more you start to think about it with real life logic, the more it starts to fall apart. And that's kind of the beauty of it. It's very much its own thing. It's its own creature. It's a movie that belongs in the realms of movies. It doesn't belong in our reality. Controversial for sure. I imagine we're going to talk about a couple of, I don't even want to say outdated elements, just questionable. Pedro Almodóvar has definitely some issues when it comes to sexual abuse or consent in his movies. Big issues when it comes to trans representation, which is Pedro is going to some dangerous territory right there. But still, overall, I think this is a very, very good film. Probably a top 5, top 6 Almodóvar for me. And Gael Garcia Bernal, we don't talk about him nearly enough as a performer. He's a patron saint of sensual cinema. He loves to make them horny films. So, yeah, this was very, very good.
I guess I can jump in quickly. Pedro Almodóvar is a guy, I think like a lot of people discovered him with Pain and Glory. Since then have gone on, especially kind of this past week, and really tried to view a lot of his work, a very big filmography. So I don't think anyone's probably seen them all. Um, Bad Education, I think like continually though with his filmography, I have this narrative where there are some that stand out of like really wanting to love his work and just feeling like I can't fully say a lot of them like hit that high point for me.
Mhm.
Bad Education kind of falls into that camp for me. I think there's a lot here that's good. Nick, I think you gave a very good like overview of this. There's a lot of interesting conversations around performance, around sex, around reality and what's fictional. I love that you mentioned Vertigo. Ebert also did in his review. I think that's a very good comparison kind of for inspiration here. I think this is probably one of the most fun, or I guess rather like worthy Almodovar films when it comes to unraveling itself and unraveling what's really happening. Is a very engaging watch, as little things get revealed here and there. But for some reason, there was something here that I felt like it was just missing for me, as far as it being this really strong personal reflection or having this really like poignant point. There's a lot here that it gets discussed: sexual abuse, growing up queer, growing up with the religious like conversation between religion and queerness, filmmaking, finding emotional catharsis through filmmaking, using film to digest and understand things. I think those are all worthy points, but I don't know if it quite comes together. And I question, this was made in what, 2004. I question if, because we know a lot of this is very close to Almodovar's life and we know a lot of this is very personal, I wonder if he just wasn't fully ready to hit it as strong as he did with like Pain and Glory, for example.
Yeah.
But for me, this is a film I constantly wanted to love. But coming out of it, I think it's really good. Don't get me wrong. I just think I can't say I quite love it, at least on a first viewing. And I am shocked for being so popular and being so dense. There really isn't like a lot of people out there talking about this film. Normally with a film like this, I try to see, if there is interviews online. I try to read people's opinions, watch people's opinions, and there really isn't that many people talking about the film, which feels weird because I do think it is probably one of the more worthy Almodovar films when it comes to discussion.
Mhm.
But for me, it was one step behind, I think, where I wanted it to be, but that also might have just been false expectations with what it was going to be. So I don't know. Jack, what were your thoughts?
Well, just be, you two don't know I'm going to do this, but I'm going to. Don't be worried. I'm not going to say anything scandalous, but I do have to start with that we've had a complaint off a listener last Friday. Sorry, not last podcast that we did, our recording. We did Ferrari, and I misquoted something. I used the word ethereal to describe the ending of Michael Mann films, and I've been notified by an avid viewer who happens to be my wife that the actual pronunciation is ethereal. So I just want to apologise to that person. It won't happen again. But to go back onto Almodovar, out the two of us, out the three of us here, I'm not overly sure about Carson's viewing, but you two have a far greater grasp on this director's filmography than I do. Out of a lot of prominent contemporary filmmakers, I'd throw my hands up here and say that Almodovar is probably the most blind spot I have. I've never gone out and watched these films, partly due to access and partly due to interest, because they just don't crop up. My first one was A Human Voice at the BF at London Film Festival 2 years ago,
Oh,
maybe 3 years ago now.
nice.
Yeah, which I thought was fine. But just a
Yeah.
short film, just a 30 minutes film. But again, a film festival. And then Venice, Parallel Mothers, I watched as well, not knowing it was Almodovar. So my experience with it has been on a festival run. And then last year, midway through, I was like, right, I'm going to get a lot of stuff out of my system. I'm going to watch a lot of stuff I want to watch. I want to watch more queer stuff. I want to watch more independent work, older films. And I watched So Excited, the comedy on the airplane, which I thought
Oh,
was
did you
fine.
like it?
I thought it was
Yeah.
fine, yeah. I think it has an interesting sensibility, and I think it echoes a lot of his comedic sensibility and sentiment to a lot of issues. There's a lot of sexual melodrama. It's very tongue-in-cheek. Um, again, representation is a very interesting thing in his work. He's incredibly queer, and it comes to his work. full-heartedly, and I think there's quite a tremendous piece of material that he puts forward. So when Carson said Bad Education, I was like, right, I'm going to watch this. I wanted to be part of the podcast, and I haven't seen anything else. However, I am within reason. I do understand quite a lot of the context around his filmography. So while you were saying about Pain and Glory, Carson, mine was The Skin I Live In, the 2010 one. That was the notoriety. That was like, oh, okay, this guy's relevant to filmmaking, and like now through me being awakened to who this was as a filmmaker, let's say, just in the public sphere. And I think that answers your question a little bit later on about why this gets quite lost, because I think that's the one where it's like, oh shit, there's a lot of things there. But that's another podcast. I'm probably in the middle here, more so. I quite like this film. I'll say this much: when it opens, to me, echoed sort of this aesthetic of a Brian De Palma film, which is interesting in tone for me, because I was like, oh, this is going to be quite dark. I wonder how he's going to do comedy, because for me, it's always just been comedic and then some really dark stuff in parallel. There's some really dark stuff. Again, it goes back to the Franco regime. Here, this is what it was advertised as, like Franco regime in the 60s and stuff. It's not a Brian De Palma film. I think it wants to be in part, but I think this is a film that touches so many types of genre, so much types of tone and thematic. It's like, it's very difficult to sort of take in. 106 minutes as well. It's not long, but it touches on everything. The one thing here, I felt maybe that Carson said about there's one thing that's slightly missing. For me, this isn't a violent film through physicality. This is a violent film through dialogue. This is the age of innocence in being a nasty film in Scorsese's filmography. I feel like from what I've seen, this is just an incredibly vicious, nasty film where we're talking about stuff. People are saying stuff to each other, horrid stuff. There's manipulation. There's blackmail. There's horrible sort of themes going on here. But again, there is sexual violence here. You don't see a lot of it, although it is prevalent. It's almost sort of a lot of it is spoken, which I found made it even more uneasy, because it was almost watching this as in, again, what Carson said, it feels like a retroactive biographical underbelly here, and it felt like a director was probably getting it on screen to even commit to himself that this happened. It's very what's the word? It's not lethargic. It's
Cathartic.
Cathartic. Sorry, my brain's everywhere. It felt like a very cathartic experience, but it also felt very difficult to watch at times. There's a lot going on in this film, a lot. So I'll move on very quickly here. I liked it for what it is. I think it's a really, really interesting film. How it tackles framing, narratives, very interesting. It's very difficult to watch at times. It's almost like a very evil film. But I do think that because of what he's done post this, especially in The Skin I Live In, with its representation, specifically how it does it within the horror aspects of it, this has been pushed to one side, when really this probably says a lot about Almodóvar as a filmmaker in how he crafts, as well as his input into the themes. Granted, the representation here is very interesting. In 2004, which is again 2 decades ago now, which is granted, you can sort of give a slight leeway to the representation that he's putting on screen. However, he's been quite a proponent of putting trans representation, or authentic trans representation, on screen as well. So there's a lot to divulge. I wouldn't even know where to start, but from what essentially is my first going back to a filmography, this was fascinating. I don't know where, Carson, you want to go after that, but yeah, there's a lot to break down here in terms of everything, really. I'll let you lead the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting. I like that you bring up the blackmail and everything, and you're like, oh, that's a lot. Just prepare yourself for when you watch all of Pedro Almodóvar's films.
Yeah.
Very in line with all of them.
Yeah.
I guess maybe we can start with, I think we all kind of mentioned the representation throughout this film. Specifically, I think the trans representation is very interesting. Something Almodóvar has been very interesting with when you look at The Skin I Live In, The Skin You Live In. I forget what the actual film is titled.
Yeah.
Very interesting how Almodóvar, and kind of, I guess, tying multiple points together in the sense of like, I think in that film you have some very strange representation in that, but you also have this element of camp that I think really kind of tries to tie itself all together. I'm not a big fan of that film, just to be honest, so like maybe I'm not the best to defend it and bat for it, but like I here you don't really have any camp, and you mentioned also the comedy. I think that's something that is not lacking per se, because I don't think you necessarily need a ton of camp in this type of film. But I find with the representation, it's interesting to see Almodovar attempt to have very, I would say, in his mind, like genuine, wholesome, these are empathetic characters, um, trying to just kind of live their lives and deal with what's happened to them. Under a modern context, though, both I think you could read into their implicit motivations for why they are trans. You can read into the performers they got. Like when you read into it, I definitely think it's probably the area of this film that I struggle with the most under a modern context. Not to start like the podcast on a very like serious note, but I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. Where like I think if looking at it, that's probably the biggest, and I think it's with Almodovar in general. With all these filmmakers we talk about that are older, I meant we are like, oh, go watch their filmographies. I think it's probably best for Pedro. People don't like fully go into all of his works. I think a lot of them aged quite badly, to be honest.
Yes.
But I think that's probably one thing here that I struggle with. And it never really has, again, like I think with Almodovar, he constantly has these ideas where it's like there could be a really interesting read here about trans life, about trans empathy, but it never feels like it wants to have that conversation fully. And I feel like that with a lot of Almodovar's themes and topics and discussions throughout his filmography, where it's like this character, yes, is a human, yes, has these things. I don't think it's awful representation, but it never has like that soul or that scene that really hammers it in. I don't know if that's Nick, you might disagree.
I actually agree. No. I think more often than not, maybe even always, to be honest, Almodovar uses trans characters more to the service of the plot and the lead, rather than treating them as their own character. I think it's very telling in a way that, it can be twisted. We're doing criticism here, so we can twist it into a very positive. It's like, oh, in this movie you're always seeing the trans character's perspective from someone else's point of view, so you're always getting different people's perception of reality, but you never get their perception of reality. The only objective piece of truth of Ignacio's life is the final piece of paper that's delivered. That's like the last piece he ever wrote in his life, and it's not even finished. So I think it's interesting. We can twist it into a way of like how Ignacio's voice is removed and taken away from them and all of that. But the pedophile priest gets a way more character and sympathy than the junkie trans woman. Like it never changes the name. Even that's kind of interesting because it's always Ignacio. People always refer to her as him. Like it's tricky even in terms of pronouns. Like I don't know. I think this subject has come up multiple times in his films, and yeah, I really love. That's also the weird thing. Like I think Almodovar has three different types of projects that he always makes. It's either a comedy, like Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. It's either a grounded drama, like Padres Paralelas and Dolor y Gloria. But then you have these genre exercises, things like this, like The Skinny Living, like the musical that Jack mentioned. So I think those are the most complicated movies of his, because he's trying to juggle all these different tones, and for me it worked. It's definitely gripping, which is something that I was not expecting, especially seeing it again for a second time after like 5 years. But I don't know. I don't remember where I read it, but like someone was asking at the end, what's the message of this movie? And I was like, well, I really don't know. So I'm interested if that's like if we're going to uncover it in some way by the time we finish this conversation. But that's something that I found interesting. Is like, what's the message of this movie? Because I don't even know if there's a message. If there's supposed to be a message here. I definitely come away with a lot of conflicted emotions, but I kind of like that. I like that it's definitely a movie that poses a lot of questions to the viewer, and it's almost up to you to decipher them. But in terms of what you were saying, Carson, I especially agree. Rewatching this movie, like, why didn't I love it the first time around? Because like halfway through, I was like, this is pretty great. Like I'm in it. Why didn't I love it? And I think the ending, we're talking about like the last 5 minutes. It's not that they are like bad, but they're just completely underwhelming. It almost feels like he didn't know how to end it. I was like, it's lacking like that punch. I think like the final shot of Dolor y Gloria, one of the finest final shots of the last few years, in my opinion. Just like, the reveal of what you've been watching, it's incredible. Even for better or worse, The Skin I Live In, or All About My Mother, Volver, like all these movies have like terrific endings. This movie, it's almost great throughout, up until the ending, like that final scene. Like you're supposed to come out crying almost. Like, oh, he finally got the message of his lover. We're spoiling the shit out of this, by the way. But like, he never gets to spend time with them. Like, yeah, but it doesn't like. It's not like Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Like, it's not that type of like, oh, it was doomed from the beginning. It's like, oh, it's sad. And this box is just woo, come on screen. Here's what happened later. Even that element it's very campy. It's very, it's part of his melodrama. It's part of his brand, being very like in your face with the style. There's one shot where like a child's head is bleeding, and he cuts like the frame in half, and he moves. He splits his head open in a literal sense in the edit. So there's some very clever, kitschy effects that he uses, but yeah, it doesn't land in the finale.
I find him to be quite an expressionist director, and throughout the themes that I've seen, and I know of him in context, having done multiple essays, done a lot of writing about him as a filmmaker, and listened to a lot of people talk about him and write about him, etc. He's an expressionistic director on repression, and I think that's really an interesting ideology to go through as a filmmaker, because political expressionistic and stuff like that, like with the German stuff, and then you've got specifically in queer, it's really interesting because repression is sort of experiencing something and not experiencing it at the same time. It's like a really strange theoretical viewpoint, because and it goes back to the issue of representation as well here, because you bear in mind, I think, again, I'm not the greatest person to talk about this, just from my opinion of looking at film studies. Queer film has sort of been on the back burner since, let's say it really had a turn in the 60s and then the 70s, and then it goes into the mainstream in the 80s, and then you have the MPAA with the 90s and early 2000s really pushing back on American stuff. Again, there's someone here who's far better talking about that than me. I'll let them go after. But I find that there's been so much sort of repression in that sensibility about filmmaking that it's had a lot of time then to catch up on. And I think if you run before you can walk, of no fault of your own, of course, you're going to trip up and make mistakes. And I do think a lot of representation on that front, especially in 2004, I can give a slight leeway to. That being said, knowing that he's incorporated in queer cinema to the intro of the top of his hairline, like this man is engulfed in a wonderful way, and that he's had representation of trans, queer, all of it throughout his filmography, there really shouldn't be an excuse. And also then to bring a South American actor in and not actually use a Spanish actor, I find fascinating as well. I think we should get on that a bit later, but to get back to the point about representation, especially about repression, I think that's a difficult film to sort of try and push forward to an audience, because it's only the people who have had repression or have been repressed, should I say, about sexuality, about image. Everyone else is fine. Everyone else lives their life. You don't see the pain, and you don't see the humbling of those people by a group of other people who, say what it is, don't really give a shit after the fact. Once it's been pushed aside, you don't entertain it. So it's interesting to sort of see that on a cinematic level. And here, I think he's trying to echo the same sentiments of an audience not really getting to experience what they just should have experienced. And Carson, you come in after this in a second just to back this up, because you've done a wonderful essay in the making of it. Not to big you up here, but you'll be better than here there. But I think this film throughout, I think that's why the ending. I agree with you, Nick, about the ending, but I've got issues with it on a separate front. But the fact that nobody in this film gets what they want through through repression of society, political stuff, having their childhood taken away, others having to make do with other things that then form a lifestyle that that's paining everyone else, but ultimately it's the one that they've had to choose because of factors throughout their life, because of other characters in this film. It's very difficult to sort of express that on a cinematic level. I think he achieves it here because I don't think he gives the audience what essentially they want with a finale, and I also don't think he gives the characters what they want. There is no one who ends this film in a happy note. These characters have an indication of seeing perhaps the reality in what's happening. They have knowledge of other things that have happened, and they have some semblance of hope, knowing that people have got what they deserve. But in the same token, they sort of start where they begin. And I don't think it's a fulfilling thing for an audience to sort of participate in, because you don't feel a character development. But I think this really does represent the idea of just repressed people, in the fact that these people are openly gay, openly queer, open with their own sexuality, but repressed in a societal sense, a physical sense as well, where and also for a sense of probably being able to live their own lives on their own accord. So I think the justification is probably works better on that. For me, on the thematic, I think it's fine. But Carson, if you come in after this, because I do feel that there's an ideology here of repression, and I think it is well showcased. It's just not very fulfilling for an audience who come into this and probably perhaps don't understand, not understand it, but haven't lived that like that. I don't know. Perhaps if I was queer and I'd see this, I would find this story far more heartbreaking than it already is for me. It's actually quite like
queer and Catholic.
Yes, yeah, and which is the Spanish operandi, isn't it, as well? And it also comes from the Franco regime of religion, communism, like stuff like that, and it's you get built around that ideology where you're a part of the people as well as God. But if you're queer, or God forbid, you want a fluid idea of gender or sexuality, you go against that ideology. So again, for me, I think it does a really good idea of projecting that. But for an audience, it feels unfulfilling. But I think that's the point. This story is unfulfilling. It's horrifying. That there's a lot of people within this narrative who have been repressed on other levels who are never going to have that left. It's going to carry them like a scar, like a wound. And the fact that we start the story with the opening up, and we're trying to ignore it and ignore it and ignore it until we get to that ending where, it's just, I think it's quite brutal, that finale with a note. We'll go into expose it later, but that's all I have to say on that for just yet. But it is a very dark, difficult film about repression on multiple levels, haunting. In fact, for me, I thought it was fucking brutal at the time. Pardon my French.
I mean, definitely a brutal film. I think that if you boil it down, Nick, you mentioned like what is the point, or I guess message of the film, and I also kind of like really had to think about that. I think this piece overall is a more observational piece on looking at these events that happened in childhood and what that led to everything, right? All this led to this, came from this traumatic event with these priests, with the sexual abuse, in that you could implicitly read repression of these priests in that religious conversation and what led them to be these terrible people. But I think that's ultimately, when you boil it down, you look at, yes, repression, but I think it all comes back to this observational look at the effects and the aftermath and the consequences of these traumatic events that happen in childhood, and where that pushed these characters, whether it pushed them into cinema and finding that as a release, whether it pushed them to try to escape what happened to them in multiple ways. I think that's especially where the film gets really questionable with its voice. I think it all comes back to that in a way that I think is good. Again, I think it's weird because I think this film is, you mentioned, Jack, like maybe you were queer, it would be more haunting to you because of the stuff with religion. I almost feel like it's so specific to these emotions that probably Pedro has from his time in the church, in his time with sexual abuse in the church. I almost feel like it's so personal to that it's like, even me, I feel like I'm on the outside, I guess, of the emotional trauma, which is good, but to a point. But like, it feels like I am even on the outside of the emotional trauma within the film, because it's not even really about like just being gay and being religious, right? It's not even like that. It's specifically this relationship with the priests, which I think is still haunting. Like, to be clear, like, I'm not saying like it holds no power. It's a very haunting film, right? Everyone at home. But yes, it just feels like this is one of those expressions that is so personal that I feel like Pedro Almodóvar or people with that lived experience probably would find this like really reflective, display of their truth. I didn't feel that way. And I feel like that might be why there's some of a disconnect. Is that the emotions, and I don't think the film even really does a ton of work to try to make that universal. Which good enough. I don't think it needs to, right? When you're making this personal expression, the film itself is, largely about the power of cinema. And when you display your truth on screen and you get that mirror back to yourself, the power within that. So I'm not even saying that was like a complaint or like I wish they did something differently, but I do think that is a consequence of some of the choices they make, is that it feels like it pushes the audience, if you don't have this lived experience specifically, to the outside, I guess I would say.
Yeah, further on that then, just to question you further on that, with its meta filmmaking about expressing and exploring in context the film through the ideals of a script, a screenplay, then to a reality within the film, them shooting the film, the substance of it, again re-referencing the screenplay that's been written by one of the characters and about the trans representation, and then also the metaphorical viewpoint of the actual Pedro making this film about a film about a queer story. Do you think that then further models and perhaps muddles the actual? I don't want to say ideology of the film, because I think it's abundantly clear what this film is trying to get at. But do you think that message about just not perhaps the actual central story of just this innocence being lost? Do you think it overcomplicates itself then, or do you think it ejects itself from it and it wants to focus on the framing of this story rather than the actual substance of it? How then do you feel about that?
I think it undoubtedly complicates it, but I don't think that's a negative thing per se. For me, I found that to be the most like, maybe not like the most haunting, but I found that to be the most engaging part that I emotionally resonated with. As someone, I'm sure we all do, like, who really uses cinema to like emotionally process. Like, and I think that also explains the identity of this film and just like tells you pretty directly what the filmmaker is doing with the feature you are watching. For me, it definitely complicates it, but I think that is kind of needed. I think those two conversations work really well together. So I have no issues with it, even though it does complex. It does make it a very dense film, even just trying to put like the timeline together, especially when you get like people who like take on the same persona, let's say. Like it makes it a very jumbled, dense feature that you kind of have to keep track of and unravel slowly and carefully. But for me, I found that to be the best part of the film, was the view of filmmaking.
Yeah,
The only
I agree.
reason,
I agree.
yeah, sorry. The only reason why I bring it up is because I think I quite like the framing, because I think it's a very strange, because he doesn't particularly give you the insight of what he's doing at first. He lets you figure out. Then he's quite conscious about it. This is Pedro, the director. That being said, I do think how then it reveals its third act protagonist. It is quite difficult, and the idea of vulnerability, because you get Gail, who starts crying about it, and you don't quite understand the context of why this person just bursting into tears. You think it's because of the actual substance of the performance of what's just happened, but then you realize further on how that actually is quite frightening for that person to once again relive it, which again works on this subtextual meta level again, to quite actually a highlighted and undoubtedly quite genius level of projection, especially with a narrative. That being said, I found that because it goes too deep into that at times, and it wants to frame itself and then come back out slightly, but then frame itself back into this context, and then we get a reveal that a lot of what we've seen is actually through the context of this film being developed. But then the third act reveal of the actual priest comes to light. I find that when there was on screen, and we have these conversations, and we see a lot more backstory to what's happened. I think that's fine. That's the melodrama in this film that works fairly well. But you don't really get this identification of that man as a fucking monster, because you haven't got the sequences before of him. So you and also the name is then changed. For Stranger, because obviously he's had to leave the clergy and stuff like that, and it becomes quite clear when the film moves on. But the film identifies a horror monster who does horrific things, who says horrific things, who manipulates children, and you have this monster in your eyes, and then it does this switch and bait reveal where actually that's not the person, that's someone who's playing that person. It slightly overcomplicates it for me in the idea of that for a lot of audience members, including myself, I was like, oh, okay, I then have to understand who this is, and then this person does horrifying stuff. I just thought there was like just a I don't know, just a difficulty in accessing both images and who these people were. That's all. Just on
I want to push back a little bit on that.
Go on.
Mainly because I found I found that part, what you call like the bait and switch of the priest character of Padre Manolo, to be actually very interesting, because the way we see him portrayed in the film, not only like I forgot to write down like the name of the actor, but just incredible. So I don't know, just disturbing, slimy, but in a way that's not cartoonish. It doesn't go over the top. It's it genuinely unnerving, I think, in some scenes. But then it's revealed that you're watching just the actor, and that's how it's written in the script. And so I found that interesting that you're still seeing like someone else's experience of these events from their perspective. So he's portrayed as an objective monster, and what he did is criminal. And then when you see him, you see his perspective, and he's trying to paint himself in, let's say, not in a negative, but it's like, I wasn't that bad, but still what he's doing is incredibly predatory. Like, he goes back to his student's apartment, student that he abused when he was underage. He was a pedophile, like, straight up. And the door opens, and he finds a trans woman, and he's just like, I'm out. Like, no, that's your own thing. I'm not turned on by this. But your younger brother in the other room, with his shorts, and that's when he gets interested. And I was like, that's very upsetting. I was like, this is fucked up, because the way he's telling it, and the way almost it's shot, it's like, you see like the beauty of the boy's body, and it's like, it's very sensual, but you're like, yeah, but you're still seeing it from like someone is a pedophile, and you really don't know how much younger one is. So it's like, Jesus Christ, like he hasn't changed. He may have changed name. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Like, he's just sheds his skin or whatever, or all his wool, and he like comes back, but it's never changed. Actually, I found that to be very, very compelling, and the fact that you like, oh yes, like, I did those things, but I was a bit against them, and like he's the one that wanted to kill Ignacio, and I did this, and like, he's painting his own picture of his own version of reality. And of course, if you're a monster, like, that's what we talked about in the Killers of the Flower Moon episode. Like, if you're the one committing the heinous crimes, from your point of view, you're still gonna find ways to justify yourself. And it's not necessarily trying to make you sympathize with them, but I think it's important to show these layers of humanity, to also remind you that, yes, they have choices that they make, like, people make choices that lead to some horrible consequences. And I really hate that, like, the way he acts narrative wise, in a good way, I mean, where he's essentially trying to ruin one's life. He just comes on set where he's like, I found out this is happening. Well, let me tell you a story now, okay? Because if I can't have who I want, neither can you. So I'm going to just destroy this man's life for you. You can never look at him the same way again. And I can just go on with my merry life, probably die of cancer because he's coughing his lungs out. So I found that to be kind of the tragedy, the effective tragedy of the last act. Like, that entire portion, like, it's like a train wreck. It's like, Jesus. Oof, it's rough.
I'm kind of in the middle of both of you. Maybe it's like nihilistic, but I always, with cinema, when you're talking about a topic like this that is very complex, very important, very evil, very explicit, like, I don't think there's any argument, very evil, I always kind of think of like the lowest common denominator of person who's going to go watch this and be like, I trust us three to be able to morally parse what the film is saying. I always think the message needs to be clear to where every single person, no matter who you are, no matter what your comprehension skills of cinema, I think you need to come out of it and have a very clear message on, like, is this evil or should we have sympathy for this character, or what level of sympathy we should have. Pedro Almodóvar in general, I think, really struggles with that when it comes to sex and sexual abuse. Talk to Her, like, specifically, is a very, very, controversial feature in that way, and it's one I really struggle with. I think you need to have a scene then. I appreciate Nick, and I agree for, like, me, and I think, like, I get what the film is doing. I get this character. I have my moral stances against this character, obviously. So like for me, I have no issue. But I think you need to have like that scene that just like hammers it in at the end and says like, no, you shouldn't necessarily feel sympathy, or this character is not innocent in any way, this person is evil and should be condemned and is awful. I don't think the film fully does that. And especially like the sexual abuse in the church is like obviously a topic that's been talked about for a long time. 2004 is a very different era than we were talking about in the context of now, and that
Yeah.
understanding of it and that acceptance of it. I think it's a very dangerous game to have a character like this be open about this, have it, and then offer empathy or offer different perspectives and not really hammer it in. I just think it's a very dangerous game. I don't know if any of you have seen The Zone of Interest this year, but like that's a film from Glazer that I think like does a really good job at balancing that, because I think it is worthwhile to show that these evil people are not like monsters from a fictionalized movie, right? They're just normal people. No one like thinks of themselves and be like, oh, I'm really evil, I'm just gonna ruin people's lives. Killers of the Flower Moon, that's a good example. No matter what my thoughts of the film are, like that is an intention within that film, is that these people do not think that they are necessarily bad. And what do you tell yourself to justify that mindset to where you can live with yourself? I just don't know if Pedro does that well throughout his filmography, but especially here. So I think I'm kind of in the middle of like, I agree. I think little things like the name change and stuff, like, I don't know if we need to be putting up so many walls between these characters, especially if we are going to not necessarily have, in my opinion, that very direct scene that says like combined, like the person needs to be judged. I just think it's a weird game to play, but it's one that Pedro, and I think like, I also just am speaking not with a ton of context here, but from what I've seen, I think Spanish sensibilities with cinema and with sex in cinema is very different than other standards in a sense. Not that it's good or bad in either way, but I just think we're dealing with a very different cultural understanding of these topics and of sex. And I wonder if that plays into it also.
What type
But
of
something
differences
is
do you
missing.
feel? I'm interested just from
From
your
what I've seen, I
experience.
think that they're very much so more, there's a lot less weight, I guess, given to sexual displays on screen, to
Mm,
morally questionable sexual scenes. I'm a big fan of the show Money Heist, which is terrible, but it's on Netflix. And like, there's multiple characters within that who've done really questionable sexual things, but then get empathy or then get reworked to be heroes by the end. And it's very weird and questionable. But like, I find with Spanish content I consume, and again, not that it's good or bad, but I just think from like my sensibilities with it, it does feel like sometimes those topics get redemption a little bit quicker than I would like, or not necessarily justified as much as I would like. Not that this film like justifies him, by the end you're not like, oh, I stand this guy. But it is something where I feel like you need to hold a little bit more weight and be a little bit more direct than you are.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree with Carson here as well. The way you explained it, Nick, I think you give a lot more credence and credibility to it as an explanation rather than in the context of the film. I think the way you devise that works quite well. I think the film gives a little bit more to be desired in the fact that if that's the sort of the ideology he was going to put forward in the film, why not use the exact same actor and then try and again let the performer craft that and let the performer make himself to be a monster in the actual fact of what he's doing as in the clergy, and then as someone who ultimately then becomes a normal walking part of society, try and have that manipulation with the character, and I let the actual performer do so, because I also agree with Carson, the fact that there's then a name change, is a completely different person who we're trying to, as an audience for the last, what I would say, 60 minutes at least, or at least 70 minutes, have looked at this person as destroying one, two, countless lives in fact, but probably we're looking at two here to be unnerving, for then it to get revealed to be something else. This, I think there's definitely this immersion, this emotive cut off where it's like, oh, okay, and then we have to then really build it up with this person. And secondly, I'll not to not to retort, but I will do, to push back on your opinion of this person who brings a vulnerability. I disagree that actually that's even apparent with this character. This character is then getting manipulated, and then the tone of the film then changes in the fact that he as it becomes not vilified, but then we see a trans character blackmail him, and then there's sort of this weird juxtaposition of right and wrong, I don't know if how far the film wants to read into it, but then because they make them and the context of what they actually say in the film a junkie, then really makes this sort of right wrong what we're actually looking at here. Again, I think it goes back to Carson's issue of the representation, but also that we see this. You don't really see a person of a performer that's allowed this ideal of vulnerability either. I think this person's obviously into quite horrid, seedy things. And then again, this person is reiterating the stance on, well, things I didn't do were that bad. I'm a human being and trying to echo that. I don't think that the performance is that strong, partly because it's a different performer entirely. And secondly, because of the justification of what we know beforehand, we don't buy it. Gale might do, the performer in the film. I can't say his full name. I'll just butcher it. But is it Juan? That's the character's name. Juan might find that because he doesn't understand the context of that character beforehand. So then, for me, it breaks itself into then two very distinctive parts. From that moment on, we get like a second film that feels, in essence, very much removed from everything beforehand, both visually, because obviously we get a different character, and also emotively, because we then begin to watch someone groom someone else. We somewhat forget, in Inacio's point of view, although they're trans and now they're a junkie, and it's like, okay, we'll leave that, and then we get this grooming part of here. Again, I appreciate what you say about we're seeing this second wind of this person not really attend for the sins, but has come back for more. With context of what we get revealed later on in sort of flashbacks and the idea of narrative framing. But again, for me, it just felt lacking. That's it. I think I agree with perhaps Carson a little bit more now about the final act. For me, is just like a bit of a stump. It's like we get very strange representation, we get a very tonal representation, and we get this counter argument of what we've been seeing on screen, and it doesn't really hit. Because for me, if it was the same actor, but again, he couldn't do that with how he devises the framing. So he's at a catch-22. He has no option aside from casting someone else. And again, I think there's a far more ideal of genius that's there that hasn't been worked specifically quite well on that. Not necessarily a conflict of interest for the audience, but then it sort of leads him to think, oh, I'm doing something quite genius here. And there's perhaps there's an inclination if he thinks he's doing something that's shocking to the audience as a reveal, but also a very interesting sort of sentiment of how then he's going to predispose this character. Is he going to make them a human being? Because we've only seen the projection of this of Ignacio's script, and then we see into the actual screenplay. We've only got one radicalization, quote unquote, of a character, which I again think is a very, very thin line between what are we doing here? Are we trying to suggest that that this has not perhaps happened the way it has? Are we trying? I don't know. I think it becomes very, very blurry, very quickly. I don't know perhaps what he could counter that with. Does he just go the straight-laced route? Would that be a better film? I don't know. Would it be a more simplistic virtue? Perhaps.
Probably, yeah.
That's not Almodóvar, I'm sure. From what I've seen, there's twists and turns, and then it goes into rectangles and triangles.
He loves his dark characters. He doesn't like to give you like a white protagonist in a like a morally scale on a moral scale. It's never like, oh, they're a good person and those are bad people. It's like, no, everyone's great.
I don't think he gives credence to that character, though. I don't think he gives the idea of the filmmaker to be like, well, let's make this unnerving for the audience now. Let's try and project the idea that this priest isn't perhaps the bad person that he is, but then what that then creates for the entire thing we've seen before, murky waters. But I also don't think it's written as good as it could be in the sense of that. And also, we go into a different territory of a film like that. Then we go from melodrama to something where it really wants to pinpoint grooming, sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual insinuation. It becomes very difficult. I think he granted, like you said before, there's like three types of Almodóvar films. This is definitely in the camp of the middle ground. I appreciate you. I think you're completely right there. I've seen all three now. They're very interesting. They're all very interesting films. I do like these type of films more because I like the idea that as an audience, we're going to have to witness something and we're not going to like a lot of these things. However, because it is 2004, those same things have a very different context now. So it is a film that I think justifiably is like Carson said earlier about, we have to give it, like, well, there's a little bit of leeway. That being said, as a director and as a writer who he is, there should be a little bit more credence and context to devise that a little bit less, not bluntly, but a little bit more fluidly. We can still make this person a horrid person, but when we can also write it in a way that the audience become intoxicated and perhaps groomed as well on a sort of this again, that further meta level. I don't think the writing is strong there, and I also think as well, not to jump the gun, I appreciate it. I also think he also does the same with this finale. Those little bits of the synopsis at the end. That's another half an hour to the film. It's another film entirely. To do that and not to give any character any sense of fulfillment and finality, I think is a very dark, perhaps genius way to again represent that repression. But the way he does it in giving it a synopsis off screen, but as title cards, I thought was both underwhelming and somewhat quite anticlimactic in a way.
Very jarring.
Yeah,
stylistic
and
choice.
Yeah, and the way he the way he aesthetically devises that as well is another one. Was like, okay,
The movie's over.
Yeah,
Pack it in.
I know I appreciate there's a lot to break down there, but these type of characters are like, again, the namesake of Bad Education that we did a few years ago, Carson, is a similar type of grooming in itself, in a not necessarily grooming, that's the wrong word, but this manipulation in that we are being suggested on screen a certain type of character, and then we find out the truth, and then we find out a little bit more things about it, and we then get to have a second wind of really trying to identify and investigate into this character. I just don't think that's I think it's lacking here, but I don't think he even attempts to even try and attempt to do that, in my opinion. I don't know how you two would respond.
I think when you get too complex with complex morals like this, I just don't think Almodóvar, like, peace and love to him, I think he's very talented in a lot of ways as director and writer. I just don't think that's where he shines. I think something like What Did I Ever Do to Deserve This, I think it's called, like, that feature from him is a very, like, I think you get some complexity there surrounding abuse that is really interesting, but it's very simplistic as far as, like, at the end of the day, this person's good, this person's bad. Yes, the person who's good does this, horrendous thing, which, spoiler alert, she, like, to everyone who hasn't seen it, she murders her husband, but, like, her husband's abusive. So, like, but you get this, like, context of, like, oh, but there is, like, layers to that, and it's not, like, the right thing per se. But I think, like, it's a simpler narrative that's to follow, that then the moral complexity works. I just don't think here it works. I just don't think that's Almodóvar's strong point, especially then when you're also blending, I'm sure, personal emotions in it. Again, like, I just think, like, this is kind of a tidal wave with Bad Education, like, of a lot of Almodóvar's kind of worst traits. A really worthy story, I think, and really worthy perspective. But I think it's his worst traits as a writer kind of all coming together. And I think that holds it back quite a bit.
Yeah, it's the same feeling I had with Parallel Mothers when we watched it at the festival run, where, again, that was my first big one watching in a cinema. And it's a strange story. You start off as two Spaniards, one relatively young, one relatively middle-aged with Penelope Cruz, both having children. Something happens, not to spoil it. Then something also horrifically happens. Then the two cross, become sexual lovers, and then something also brutal happens. And then at the end, they dig up a graveyard where Franco's enemies were buried, like hundreds of bodies, skeletons. And it's like there's a lot of melodrama there, curtailed by a political expression, again, about what he seems to do. And here you get a sense of it working, but working really well in the background. Like this all goes on under a fascist regime. The reason why there's no accountability, granted, it's still in the 70s and the 80s here. So again, it's going back 20 years, even in the context of when it was filmed. So it's interesting to sort of look at that and have it as a background where you can see the influence, but it's not like this. It's not like this visual or ever literal dialogue on screen, but it's just there. Whereas in Parallel Mothers, he has to then demonstrate that's then a factor of perhaps the issues that we're seeing on screen and the remnants of the past, perhaps, that there's this, just because these people are buried doesn't mean they're ever gone, and we'll always find them. Very interesting themes, but in very two different type of tones. I think the same is here as well. I think there's someone trying to grasp a sense of self-freedom, understanding that these things went on, and having a cathartic viewpoint through cinema, which I think is so interesting and so engaging, which definitely elevates this material already for me anyway, having this discussion, also knowing Almodóvar, and we're all aware of where he's been brought up, who he is as a person. Again, as a director within cinema, this film, again, with its context of the screenplay and its narrative, work wonders. But then it goes to try to be quite smart. And not even to say smart as in it's like, oh, wow, we're going to do something crazy here. But it has to be very... it's like it has to not have a judgmental viewpoint with its finale, even though it is an incredibly judgmental film, and I think that we're watching a paedophile. Like I don't want to. You have to be so. You have to be a miraculous type of writer and also a miraculously type of performer to try and showcase a person of utter disgust on screen and give them a sense of humanity. Because if you have any moral standards, you reject the ideology straight away. Like you're not watching Downfall and watching Bruno Ganz and go, "Oh, what a terrible end!" It's like that man's Adolf Hitler. I don't have any emotional engagement about that aside from the absolute terror that's on screen. But there's also Bruno Ganz is not trying to do that. He's not trying to make Adolf Hitler. Granted, I'm going to go back to the film. Don't get me wrong, but you're watching a film. You're watching a performer not try and give substance to a person, but to a character in the sense of that you can see he's just doomed. That's the ideology of the character. This one is different. This one is trying to manipulate and groom his audience in the same way that perhaps the two children was, and maybe there's an interesting parallel there in the sense of that a manipulator is still a manipulator, even if they go after children or if they go after adult. You can still be a victim. You can still be someone who is attacked with this mentality, and someone who falls into this intoxication of perhaps someone who's older, someone who you think is wiser, which I think is interesting considering that, if you're 9 or 90, there are people out there that will swindle and manipulate people. It's horrible. It's these fucking horrible people. Perhaps I would perhaps give it a bit more credence there, but I just, again, to reiterate, I just think the writing doesn't. But I'll go faster. I think the writing that Fan Jack perhaps undermines a lot of these themes that he's trying to get to. It mars it, indefinitely. I feel that's where I would justify that. Then I would say it just undermines it for me a little bit, underwhelms. I don't want him to, granted it, but we all want this person to be like crucified, not literally, but contextually on screen. I don't want him vindicated at all. But the way that he tries to, tries to showcase it on screen, there's like this, like what Nick said, there is this slither of, oh, okay, are we for just a second, are we perhaps hinting that what we've seen is not? I don't know. I think it becomes blurry. I think there's a better filmmaker out there to do that. But all plaudits for trying it. But those themes are. No, I don't think I would. I don't think that's that. But again, perhaps that's the controversial sentiment of its director, that he doesn't give and more power to him, doesn't give a fuck. He's a repressed person, perhaps in his childhood with sexuality, undoubted politically, because he would have been, and perhaps that showcases in echoes of cinema thinking, I don't really give a fuck what you think. I've been repressed most of my life in political, sexual, gender. I'm going to put what I want on screen. Oh, okay, more power to you. I just think from the critical thinking standpoint, it leaves a little bit to be desired. I don't know how you two feel. I know I've gone on there. I think I've got to the crux of my own opinion of it anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with some parts of that, of course. No, it's I don't even know how to say it. It's probably just, I don't know. Almodóvar is very specific. It's a very specific style, very specific way of making movies. And to be honest, I don't really. I think he's almost like Marmite in a way, for the most part. There's quite a few like people that I follow on Letterboxd, and I think Carson's probably like entering that that side as well of the people that I follow. where it just doesn't work. Like as much as you can try, and occasionally it does with like very specific things, but he never reaches that level of like adoration that some people have of his films. I don't adore him per se. I would say I only really love 3 of his movies. Um, this comes close. This comes close.
Agreed.
But I also come at this not so much from the perspective of like as a critic, let's say, as a reviewer, but also as a filmmaker. And I think in a way, I don't know if it should be more explicit in like the messaging. I think that's kind of part of the power. Like he's making the movie that he's making. It's up to the audience to decide the way they see it. And I think it's more telling. Like if someone watches this movie and comes out of it thinking, well, that man wasn't so bad. The pedophile priest, he wasn't that bad. I was like, okay, well, that's like a that's your problem, man. I'm a bit worried if you think that.
Can I,
But
um,
it's definitely like something that he keeps doing with his filmography that I respect. It doesn't always pay off. But I do respect it that he doesn't really, like you said, Jack, like he doesn't give a fuck about like uh,
yeah,
the way people want characters on screen. I often have these conversations with like some family members who really like good people. Like the protagonist has to be like a good person. Like it's very just conceptually, just emotional. I think recently we even had the TV show The Curse that just finished airing, and there are some people that just couldn't watch it because they were like, I mean, these people are just so toxic. Like, oh, that's uncomfortable, and I can't watch it. I was like, that's the point. Like, if you go into a show or a film just being like these men and women and whatever have to embody my own beliefs, I think it's very hard to be turned off by that. And I kind of
yeah, it's a
like
vacuum.
that
Yeah,
Almodovar goes in very challenging directions. Though I will agree that it's more often than not sloppily made because it leads to like wildly different interpretations. Not to go back again to Killers of the Flower
yeah,
Moon, but thank God, most people like or dislike the movie. We were all on the same page of like this is the point of the film, and um, very few actually saw it as like maybe he's endorsing this man. Like come on, like they were shut off immediately. Well, with Almodovar, it's often from what I notice at least, there's always this back and forth, like some people see it one way, but others, like you both are saying, like it's very questionable. I don't know. I genuinely don't think there's like a right or wrong answer. I think some decisions would definitely hinder just the sense of the movie, the tone, the structure of it all.
yeah,
It really does enjoy the pure artistry of it all, which is something that I like, but it often comes in the way of character, comes in the way of the story itself. And again, I think that's the ultimate thing that I don't like about this film that keeps me from loving it is the way Ignacio is treated. Because if we got, let's say, like the movie is 10 minutes longer and you actually get like to read a full letter from them and you see their version of events, then maybe it's more of a like who's telling the truth, but you end on the trans person's, like the victim, to be honest, because they're a victim, on their perspective. It's like, oh, okay, well, I get it now. But I think the fact that you're never given that, whether intentional or not, and I do think it genuinely doesn't care, which is not good, to be honest. Um, but it leaves you hanging. But this kind of like, and I'm surprised we haven't mentioned him. I don't think even once in almost 1 hour of conversation. Who I think to be actually the main character of the movie, who's the director Enrique. Enrique is Almodovar in a way. I don't know so much if Almodovar sees himself as the abused little boy who becomes a trans woman. I don't think he does. I think more so than that, he sees himself as Enrique, as this man who's a filmmaker who's like looking for inspiration, and he looks around himself and then he has to dig deep into childhood to actually uncover some trauma and process it through art to then move forward, which is something that he did. I think even the fact of setting this in 1980, despite Enrique being like, what is its third feature? I think the one that he's making, like The Visit, which is a fun title. I was like, The Visit. But the one that he's making is his third feature. But 1980 is the year that he made it, like Almodovar himself made his debut with Pepe Lucy Bomb, feature debut. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that it, like, you guys were talking and I kept like having in the back of my head, like, what's the point? What's the
Mm-hmm.
message? What's the point? And I think it's just, narratively speaking at least, it's closure. Like, you have a man who's always probably thought in the back of his head about his first love. What happened to him? What happened to Ignacio? I don't know. I just, last I saw him was a kid. Who knows? And then knock knock. He comes knocking at the door. What? Okay, this script, holy shit, this is my childhood, this is my life. And he sees us as lovers in the future. Okay, interesting. And it reopens old wounds that it almost put away. And through this whole story, he ends up in the end like finding closure. I think getting that letter, a letter that was never sent, a letter that was never finished. You know, he can now move forward with his life. He got some sort of like memento in a way of Ignacio's life, and he can keep on going, making, what does he say, like making successful movies or something like that in the last line, like having a wonderful career, something along those lines. Yeah, I think maybe that's kind of the point, narratively at least. Like, we're
Just to,
focusing on like main characters but not the protagonist. He's ultimately the one that we're seeing everything from. He keeps hearing the stories, he keeps reading the scripts. We never actually see the other two, from their own perspective, both Juan slash Angel and Padre Manolo as a man. Yeah.
I would just to unpack that then, just very briefly about the actual finale with the actual villain of the piece. I think partly coming down to it as well is that the fact that he's purported to have wrote this over 10 years. I think there's a part of him, and again, this would be speaking for him here, so please, I apologise if this has come out and ever said anything against this. I think there's an issue internally to explore that character, because on one hand, as a writer and as a director, it's slightly his duty to unravel that character and to craft a 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional shape out of something, and really give it sort of a substance and a sustenance to it. On the other hand, the fact that this person is the identification and this iconography of something that is a literal sense of what's happened to him as a child or throughout his life, and also on a larger sense of being this repressive nature, I think he's also somewhat afraid to give credence to that character. I think the blur there and the issue of trying to condone both sentiments of personal and a sort of like a personal viewpoint of it in his writing, but also his due diligence as a writer as well to craft it. I think that blur is quite evident on screen, in that he doesn't really know what to do with him, and I think there's also partly in that he wants to let that character rule the roost once more, slightly to manipulate and groom Juan as well as us. But I think he's also afraid on an emotive level of opening a wound there again, which is like giving that trauma a viewpoint, and the way he ends it as well, by not giving us any finality with that character, also must be quite a difficult thing for him to have written as well, because where's the closure for him? That's what I'll say on that. Going back to your point about Enrique, I'll push back on that. I disagreed about him being the lead actor or the lead character. I think he was wonderfully placed as a third party throughout this film. He's a third party who was reading this, who was envisioning it in his head, but through the means of someone else's letter and someone else's viewpoint, he's envisioning it himself. So that's the way we see it. But I don't think he's the lead actor. I think on a more sense, it's definitely Juan, because ultimately how the story progresses is consistently through his eyes and what happens by his own association with all three characters here, which is Father Manuel, well, Sir Manuel, the Louise Homer type of actor, the actual priest, the priest within the film, and also with Enrique. So I think just on a practical level, I would say that. But also, it's interesting you talk about closure, because I think we've all spoken about its representation of Ignacio, the trans character, and the fact that it limits the reference of him and her, which I think is mostly a product of its time rather than a conscious ailment to the film. But I thought that that finale where there's a letter again, going back to the unfulfillment of wanting to move on with anything, because it ultimately comes to define these characters themselves, and because they're all repressed, and because it's so inundated with their characters and their beings, they can't ever run away from it. They have to see it head on. Perhaps Juan's has got another way to go, as we see in the synopsis at the end. There's a lot to go, but definitely for Enrique,
becomes very murderous.
Yeah. That's the. But that's the way that their story comes to an end. That's fair enough. But I thought for the story of Ignacio, to get that, to write that letter after years and years and years, and finally have this monster by the fucking balls, literally and figuratively, to indulge him with the money, still trying to cope and dying as they are through drug abuse, but also manipulating the manipulator, and then for them to die writing this letter and to say, I think we have succeeded. I think I've succeeded, and that be the final thing. I think that says a lot more for Ignacio as a person, and also reaffirms to Enrique as well that they were still a fighter. They weren't gonna ever allow that person, even if they were destroying themselves, if it's drugs and destroying themselves or other things, and going from male to female, regardless of what their story was, they weren't going to let that monster get away with it. And I found quite a lot of vulnerability in that, but also a wonderful highlight of just that strength to have to live through that life, having to live with that trauma and to accept it and to digest it. And again, because all these three characters are having to do so, they get it the worst, but also the fact that they go head to head with the beast, as you will, and really how the story works out anyway, to bring Juan into it, and Juan finally, in uncertain terms with its finale, killed him through his own torment and pain, is another segment to go into. Don't get me wrong, but I think we succeeded, just to give that little bit of hope and in their own death. Sorry, to not to vilify them, not to vilify this other human being, but to just give a bit more credence in the fact that, like, I think we fucking got him, and then it's ultimately for it to reveal it as it does in a way, inadvertently they do. I think there's something to be said about that. I don't necessarily know what, but I quite like the ending of that note. Just that to wait 5-6 years to when they've died, but to not speak to them in at least 20, just to get that footnote that at least that person, through all that trauma, in their final few moments, at least in principle, thought, or will at least went out with the idea that I fucking got him. I think it's quite a touching thing. It's very Aldo Almodóvar, isn't it? It's very evil. It's very unsubtle. It's very manipulative. It's very it's very blurry. But it is one of those characteristics of his cinema where, again, like in any means to get the last conversation, to get the last word. I think that really that puts a lot more credence to the value of that sequence itself. I would be fascinated to watch this with people from this community, specifically trans people, to understand how perhaps they think of that, because it doesn't do a great job in not showcasing trans in a mentality of consistent and constant pain and suffering and trauma. Granted, this film is about suffering, but it does ultimately pigeonhole a certain ideology, which has been categorically showcased in the likes of Dallas Buyers Club and stuff like that, where there's just, they are either prostitutes, mentally ill, or they're dying. And for a long time, there isn't sort of this sentiment that derides from that until perhaps probably more recently, I suppose, with again, even Assassination Nation touches on that, but more in a more different context, I suppose. But Barbie was good for it and stuff like that. And if we're getting used to more just common
Redefinition
representation.
New Hunter Schafer movie this year. We're thriving.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're allowed to give like recommendations of users. We can, yeah.
Why not?
I highly recommend it. I followed her for while now, like a few years. Sally Jane Black, I don't, maybe you two follow her as well, but
Right.
she's a
Okay.
trans critic on Letterboxd. All in, like, we're talking about real reviews. Like, it's not one line
Hmm.
jokes. It's not like a little paragraph. We're talking about like essays sometimes. And even though I don't always agree with her takes, it's always so interesting. And she hates Almodovar with a passion. So I would recommend reading her review for Bad Education, Skin I Live In. She has understandably saw a lot of issues with trans representation and sexual abuse. There's this whole scene that I also found questionable while watching it, in the fiction of the movie that's being filmed, where basically uh, Zahara, the trans character protagonist of the film, assaults a drunken man while he's sleeping, uh, which is played in a way that's supposed to be kind of nice. And he gave consent beforehand, but still he's drunk and asleep. So questionable. But yeah, no. So that was just
Yes.
a quick recommendation. Just very questionable. Um,
I mean, I
but
wish I hope that there are more queer voices specifically on Almodovar, because it's very interesting. I'll just mention this film also. It's very weird that, like, implicitly, I think you can read, like, the soul of the trans character is coming from a reaction to their trauma, which is not necessarily a very, like, positive idea, I would say, of like where that comes from and an understanding of why people are trans. I don't know. For me, it was just, it's very
yeah,
complex. Obviously, we
Blur,
lack a perspective here on the podcast. So like, I just really would love to see if anyone has them. Also, email at clappercast@gmail.com or message me. I'd love to have them. But trans readings on these films and trans readings on, Bad Education, all of his filmography, because it's just very weird stuff at times. Is what it is, I guess.
I'd love to know, and also like a Spaniard's viewpoint of living through this filmography in context as well, because I wonder if it's a part of the times. Because I don't know if anyone's seen a Spanish horror film called Thesis, and obviously you see Rec. Like there are they go quite hard within the rating scale. Like it's not just something that's it definitely it's not embellished. It's like ingrained within a certain cinematic culture where they just love it. Like they absolutely love showing horror. They don't hold back, which I because I partly think that the due to Franco's ideology of cinema, where he brought loads of productions in, be it like a lot of Clint Eastwood stuff, Sergio Leone, and a lot of American stuff came over. Cinema was probably one of the because he publicized. I think he would have, well, if his comments were in, he would have given it to the would have, it wasn't, we wouldn't have privatized it, would he? Would have given it to the people. Although I can imagine Franco wasn't a particularly nice person from what everybody said and read. But yeah, anyway, get back to the point. It's interesting that the outlet, and it's such a massive creative energy from Franco in harshness, and I mean, look at Pan's Labyrinth is ultimately a representation of that as well. You get it from a fascist dictator anyway, but you look at that sort of operandi and how it's filtered down into even to its not necessarily into what its audience want, but its directors and its queer directors as well. It's fascinating to look at that lineage about just the connective tissue from a dictator who opened up cinema for people all over the world to come and film in his communist dictatorship, who was a ruthless fascist, and then the resemblance of 20, 30, 40 years on of how that's influenced filmmakers in harsh horror, harsh tone. There's definitely ultimately a connection there. So it feels like this film is almost at a dissonance. You could probably read into this. I don't know, perhaps if anyone agrees, but it's interesting that this film ultimately goes against the ideology of what Franco did, but also is liberated in it as well, which is again a fucking fascinating thing for a person to have to deal with. It's like it goes back to that grooming thing, doesn't it? Where this person is doing horrible things to someone, but also gaining them trust and giving them presents and manipulating them. It's such a fascinating subconscious evaluation of Spanish filmmaking. I think Almodovar is probably someone who would agree that, in a way, that pain and suffering gave leeway to him to craft himself in this quite fascinating way. But you would have to say that both of the connective tissues are undoubtedly an influence, and it's a strange influence to bear. But that's probably further. I'll go with that. But I just wanted to say one thing as well, because we mentioned earlier, and I think we probably should give it a bit more credence. Is I was slightly unnerved when we get to the R word sequence, because I was like, I didn't really know who that person was, and he says it's Enrique, and then obviously he was like, oh shit, that's his friend Enrique. It's interesting how that's projected in the film itself, as in the motive of the screenplay from Juan, who writes that in a sense of.
It's written
'Cause
from Ignacio, the script.
Right.
Because when we
Again,
see, when Berenguer goes to the apartment, Ignacio writes the script ready.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I find that interesting to sort of deconstruct and see perhaps what the intention of that is, because I can understand on a very simplistic viewpoint here, that's just lust, because he hasn't seen them in age, and there's this sort of sensual sexual nature to it, and this person falls asleep, and it's not really what that person wanted. And then it's like seeing it in front of them, they lust to have that companionship because it wasn't given to them when they were kids, or at least they weren't allowed to grow and explore that in an ideal nature of which they should have been able to explore. Childhood were taken away from them more ways than one. That's probably the sequence for me, rather than the ending. That I know, because I've talked about the ending so much, probably I found stupid, but that's the one where I with Almodóvar, I'm like, I don't quite understand why you would put that in, knowing full well the projection of what that showcases, not only on the level of context, but also out of context, seeing the representation. If this came out now, and let's be quite honest, this would be annihilated for its representation, and rightly so, because ultimately what it showcases is a trans person raping another person who has kids and children, like on a very simplistic nature. Like, and I just sat there, I thought, like, because you got to bear in mind, when the first opening minutes came on, when it's vignette, it just screamed "Dressed to Kill" to me. That's the thing I thought this film was going for, not knowing anything about it. And then you get this quite sensitive type of film, very, very profound, very poignant. And then we get to that, and I'm like, oh right. Again, that might be the juggling of his tone. But to me, that was almost like, oh, this is going to be something to talk about. I don't know how you two felt. I might be reading that wrong. Please enlighten me. But for me, I just think it gives off really disturbing, but also really narrow-minded viewpoints. Like, what was he going to expect? The fact that hasn't come back to haunt someone. And I'm not here for cancel culture on a filmmaker who's shown that. If you've done terrible things in your private life, you've done terrible fucking things. I'm not going to. But it's interesting how that's not come back and perhaps been highlighted as something where, let's right some wrongs here. I don't know how you two feel, but I know it's a tough subject to talk about, and I appreciate that. But for me, it was the most substantial part of this film. I was like, I have no idea what you're doing. I don't think you've got any idea what you're doing in retrospect, and I seriously, I think you're putting a lot of people in jeopardy. And knowing that the actor, Gail, I'm going to pronounce
García Bernal. Gael García Bernal.
There you go. Has had had fallouts with Pedro Almodóvar on set about this, and he will deny it. But then he will deny it. But you look at the production, and you look at other sources also corroborate that he had massive issues with representational issues of sex, or literal on screen. I can only think it was that, because everything else isn't that risky. It's quite skin on skin, and it's very unsubtle. But that's the prominent scene he's in, where it's like, oh, I can imagine he had issues with that. I would love to have known, and not to make this a sensational thing, but I would love to have known what he would have said to Gail on set to convince him to do that sequence, knowing he felt vulnerable about it. Because I don't think anyone could convince me as an actor, or just being present there, to participate in that, knowing how. I mean, you'd have to see it in context for it to convince you, but just in that sequence, to me, I just think it's just. I can't defend that whatsoever. I just don't get it. Can someone explain that? Did anyone else what?
I don't know if Carson maybe wants to go first. I have. Okay. No,
Just
like,
no.
Just, you take it.
Yeah.
I'm the one who's compromising himself, going to bite me in the ass in
No,
the
no, no,
future.
no, no.
No,
That's right.
super small side notes. It's not talked about that often, but Almodovar is not an easy director to work with. He's had
Mhm.
multiple fallings out. Started working a lot with gosh, why I'm blanking on the name, but like this one actress who was in all of his early films. Then they had a falling out, and she came back, ironically, with Volver, which is like the return. She came back for that movie. Then he had
Oh, I
Victoria
know. Yeah.
Abril. She did like 3-4 films. Then they had a falling out. Rosie De Palma, Antonio Banderas before like Skinny Living and Dolor y Gloria. I was like, bye, Pedro. I'm done with you in the late 90s. So Gael Garcia lasted one movie. He got him because of star appeal. He was hot at the time after Y Tu Mama También and a couple other projects with the other Mexican Iñárritu, what's it like, the dogs movie, Amores Perros. So like uh, beautiful Penelope Cruz. The other one is like falling out. Look at that. So I've never found, and I've never actively looked for like details about that. Like what, just why? I know these things happen multiple times. I don't know why. I don't know the details. But yeah, he's not an easy director to work with. But speaking of this scene, I will say just preemptively, like I'm not a fan of the way it's made. Especially something that like that's something that I'm doing right now. I had like an idea for a script years ago that I'm like actively developing now for a short film. And one thing that I changed is that, without going into details, but like I started to feel uncomfortable with the way some sexual acts were portrayed, and even violent acts, because they fell into the realm of like potential assault and abuse. And so like I've reshaped it now where it's more sensual and explicitly has like consent in a very twisted way. You'll see the
Yeah.
finished movie, it goes in some dark directions, but there is consent. People say, yes, you may do that thing. But in this movie, it's lacking. It's just objectively lacking, and it feels uncomfortable. But with a mindset of, let's say, 2004 era glasses, where you're like, yeah, this scene is fine. The way that I saw it as, it's a power reversal and a reversal of the roles. We often talk about, well, not we, but like the internet loves to talk about sex scenes are unneeded. I think this is a sex scene that's needed for the character of Zahara. um, Without the consent part, let's just like pretend that doesn't exist for a second. It starts off as, well, like she's prostituting herself. She's giving away her body for sex. She's a sex worker, essentially. She works in the cabaret, and then she goes away with some client that she kind of lures in a way, she flirts with during the night. And she's giving him a blowjob, which is a very like, I'm giving you the pleasure, I'm doing the act, I'm delivering the pleasure. Uh,
Mhm.
then she's almost like starting to rob him, looks in the wallet, there's nothing, fuck, like it wasn't even a good John. But then she sees, oh, this is my ex-lover, my first lover, the first love of my life. And it's still hard. It's a very important detail in the scene. And she takes him in a way, and it becomes more like an heteronormative, you can almost say, like portrayal of how sex is made, where it's like, oh, it's the intercourse. It's like that's the sex. And it becomes more about that passion, and it's the reversal, even just physically. Instead of being like face down lying, she's on top of him. um and at the end she leaves him money, which is kind of funny. She puts money into his jeans before leaving, and she doesn't steal anything. She actually gives him back, she gives him more money than he had before, which is kind of a fun, weird little thank you. It's one of those things with Almodovar where it's just baffling, but it also oddly makes sense in its own way. Like many things that we talked about today, like it's not easy. I'm also not super sure about this reading, but it's such I don't know. It's an interesting scene, and he always has these very twisted power dynamics. I don't know if you've seen "Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down," Carson. Maybe that's one. Yeah, like that's another one that's completely insane. Law of Desire. Like he's not for cookie cutter. Oh, they love each other and everything's vanilla. It's like, no, that's not Pedro. But that's at least my reading. I can be completely off point.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm kind of mixed. I mean, I think that's one of the things about Almodóvar. I mean, I feel like we've kind of covered it, but like, I think he is very interesting politics when it comes to consent, when it comes to representation of sex, when it comes to sexual abuse in multiple different ways. Like, I just feel like it's something that he plays with in a way that isn't always something I jive with. I think it leads to weird implications for his characters. Some he then wants to make protagonists, or some he wants to then give redemption to, that I don't vibe with. Like, I just feel like it's something with, like, if you want to dive into his filmography, and I'm not saying like you have to, right? I think it's very valid to just say like Pedro Almodóvar is not a filmmaker some people can engage with. I think it's just something you kind of have to like learn to like live with and accept. Not that you say it's good. I think you could very criticize each film for it. But it's just something that comes with the territory of Pedro Almodóvar, which no one really discusses, because I don't think a lot of people have seen a lot of his films. Though I'm like so shocked. Like, after seeing a lot of these, Talk to Her. Not to, we don't need to get into it fully, but like, it's arguably one of his like most famous films. Won
I don't
Academy
get
Award
it.
for screenplay. Like, it's pretty well known, but no one talks about like the politics of that film, which is fucking insane. Like, and is very disturbing and gross and just not something I vibe with at all. Um, I don't get how people are not actively like looking at that film and then trying to make bigger statements about Pedro. Not to criticize Pedro, not to be like we need to witch hunt this guy. You know, sorry Pedro, on your episode that was supposed to be celebrating you. I guess this was
We
kind of what
love
I'm
you.
kind of closing with. I do love you, Pedro, and I think your queer analysis is really beautiful that you put that on screen how you do. I think you're really talented. I love your colors of your films. But when it comes to screenplay, when it comes to things within this film, and he keeps coming back to it, like it continuously in his filmography is sexual abuse and weird things about consent and weird things about representation, and it's like, dude, just move on, or like do something else please, at the very least. Like, it's part of who he is as a filmmaker and how he is with storytelling, and it just kind of like is kind of sucks. But it's there.
I think my two
I,
favorite movies of his are Volver and Dolor y Gloria, and I think they might be the only two that don't have like sex in them
the
explicitly.
two i the two I don't check out, of course.
mm,
You haven't seen Dolor y Gloria, Pain and Glory?
Oh, Pain and Glory. Sorry.
Sorry,
Yes.
yeah,
Sorry.
sorry.
I'm a dumb American. Okay.
yeah,
I
come on,
don't.
Nick.
I need the English titles here.
They come no, like Pain and Glory and Volver. I think Volver is Volver with Penelope Cruz. Just it
It's
hasn't been translated.
vulva. It's just vulva.
Volva. Is
Yeah,
that how you say
vulva.
it?
I also think that,
Definitely
like,
not.
to echo what Carson said as well, I feel like from watching two features, one shot, and I'll probably watch the other shot tonight with Pedro Pascal and Ethan Hawke. That sequence itself, what we've just talked about, is the identity of him as a filmmaker. In that it's very lustful, it's full of passion. In the moment, he writes it, he directs it, he does whatever he does, he gets it on screen, and the film is sort of this living, breathing entity. But he's not a filmmaker that retroactively or even retrospectively has any idea what these I've got to say. And I think it's quite warming and then frightening, because the warming part of it is that he works purely on passion. And that, as a filmmaker, to see a director who's just like working purely on passion, this is what my character would do. That's all well and good. Sort of, people feed on that as cinephiles. I think it's intoxicating. The issue, the worrying part of it is that the actual content of it and the context is just wildly disturbing. And it's not, like you said, Carson, it's all well and good having passion and energy, but injecting in those sequences are just, to me, is provocative for provocative sake. And he's been pigeonholed as a provocateur. Don't get me wrong, but you know, I don't see any value in that, and even in the characters. I agree with you, Nick. Perhaps it's the balance of the dynamic, but think of it in the context of it, that it's after the fact, after this person obviously can't consent. Then they try to rob them, then they don't. They have a little bit of leeway and think, oh, actually, this one, my childhood lover, or was someone very close to him, I'm sure, Enrique, and then take the power from him and do that. I just think that as an ideal of representation for what will be impacting, knowing the full well that film will live, it will find audiences every decade. It will find, well, it's had what, 2 generations now to view it. The implications of that will become more and more skew-if and more damning. And he's as someone who's obviously a creative, a director who's been in that industry for 40 years almost now. Like, come on, there's a lot more. He's better than that, I think. He's, to just say he's Spanish and he works off pure
Too much
passion.
Credit.
Yeah. Well, no, because he has to devise. It has to be relevant. Still has to devise provocative features. Don't be wrong, but that isn't provocative sake. That has got real blurry connotations. And perhaps he will say that, and well, that's a story of what I want to tell. And fair play to it, but ultimately, once you put it in the public domain and you put it in that public viewpoint of people having an opinion and it lives with the times, I have to say, I don't think we would talk about this in the same way in 10 more years. I think this film will get progressively worse over time. I think if I saw it in 2004, I would probably be far more different. Even in 2014, perhaps we would have a different viewpoint on it. Not in terms of that situation itself, but we'd be far more or less analytical. And I think that's ultimately the relationship the director's got with the work. But in 10 more years' time, and 10 years after that, and 10 years after that, this will just be sort of pigeonholed in a representation that's very poor. And I think this film, just to end my statement here, I think it's unfortunate because it ultimately dampens a feature, what Carson said was earlier on, that there's something really, really quite poignant in this and quite profound and sturdy and difficult to watch and engaging and immersive and just very plain and flatly emotional. And there are certain injections of Almodóvar that really do derail this into being something that could have been profound. And generally, that's why I probably come down on it. Aside from that, I think I've rinsed this beyond belief.
Jack, just put in context, we don't do it on the show, but like, what star rating would you be out for this?
I've been through this. I went 5, 4, and then having this conversation, I'd probably go 3, but I'd probably go a high 3 or low 4. I'm still, if I hadn't have brought up that sequence we just spoke about, I'd give it a 4. But I think that has massive implications for this as a film, for its lead actor, what it's trying to showcase. I think it's interesting. I don't know. Maybe just a 4. Maybe a 3. I don't know. I have very little comparative work because I've seen all 3 types of the films you see. I've seen the comedic, I've seen the nailed on drama, Parallel Mothers. Obviously, I'm so excited, and this. So I think I probably have to watch something similar to this, which is I Live in Fear or something. I'll watch that and I'll
talk to her probably, but ouch.
I mean, what about you, Carson?
I'd be interested in seeing your thoughts on The Skin I Live In.
Yeah, yeah, I'll probably watch it this week.
More. That's much more of a De Palma film than this.
But that also has mighty conversations with the political and social culture that we live in now, with trans representation and what it means to be. Granted, what it means to be. And I say this in quote: the culture war of what is a woman. And again, I think you have the same issues with that representation because he uses it in genre. It's what you said in the opening. He uses very much profound motifs in their own right that should be given credence and availability of context and at least content. But he uses it in a weird way of genre, like De Palma did in Dressed to Kill. Like, there's no reason to explain why aside from exposition, why Michael Caine does the things he does. Spoilers, but I still think, but oh my god, like, he dresses as a woman. That is as simple as it probably gets. As well we get on as cinephiles and we begin to grow and develop, and we have another developing type of substantive era of film that's being repressed, and it becomes more. Again, it becomes more enlightening to reflect societal norms. I just think that's going to fucking age poorly as well. I mean, I remember that when that came out, and it got cut in the UK. It doesn't have it has an issue with its BBFC, and also, like, I don't think you could actually, like, show the trailer anywhere. I don't think you could have posters of it. I just remember the absolute fucking fury that it had. I'll try to check it out, but I feel like this is going to be, like, from what you both said anyway, it's going to be a common theme here. And what worries me is that we're going to 2004, we're going to 2012, 2010, and you guys are going to 1984, 1990s. What worries me in like the next 10 years is what we're going to get in the next 5, 6, 7 years about how he now is in a world where he won't be able to execute those types of dramatic effects because the audience won't accept that. Because at the time, you could say that, I'm not saying he's spiteful or anything like that, I'm not saying he's done it in a way. The societal norms didn't push back because they weren't represented to the fullest force, you know. Now, you know, you've got representation that pushes back even against RuPaul, who's massive about his trans representation and stuff, and that's a society that is constantly now vocalized. It'd be interesting to see what then he implements in this. I know I'm going on a tangent here, but it'd be interesting to see what he implements in the further down the line, knowing full well that if he's a filmmaker who's A, afforded to be able to do that, and B, what the fan base on what audiences do and do not reject. Be very interesting. Because like you both said, that nobody's talking about these things. But I also think that because he's European and because he's Spanish, and also as well, not to disregard his filmography, and Carson, again, from your article, this doesn't translate very well to US audiences. It doesn't translate passably far from his commercial work in the sense of it goes to Venice and stuff like that, and then it goes to South by Southwest, if it goes to Telluride, if it goes to TIFF, etc. If it goes to any of the big ones, like Sundance, perhaps. The other work is lost on those people because it isn't given availability. I think it's probably going to be an interesting next few years, because I don't know if you two feel the same way, because I'm probably more up to date with his modern work. He has pushed back on that front and taken it down a notch. Like his last few works have been interesting with definitely short works about gay representation and stuff. But even with Parallel Mothers, there wasn't really. Do you don't think so?
I'm not positive for the future of Almodovar, to be
Well,
honest.
no, I don't mean that.
Because
I mean like
he's
even. I don't mean that. I mean I appreciate that. But I mean now, in the last 3 or 4, 5
based
years.
on now, I'm not positive.
So what
because
would you say
he's entering Hollywood, which is always dangerous territory. And Europe, you get public funds to make movies. He has his own production company. In Hollywood, money talks, money reigns supreme. And Carson has seen Strange Way of Life, right? I've rewatched it recently. I saw it in the cinema during the summer. I enjoyed the short. I'm like, it's all right. It's like a 3.5 stars at most for me. But I found kind of troubling that it's, supposedly, like he talked about it as the response, to Brokeback Mountain. I was like, oh, okay, let's see what he's done. And there's not a single kiss between Ethan Hawke and Pedro Pascal. There's not a single, there's like a thinly potentially compromising moment of intimacy between two adult men like these two in
But
the
there isn't
film.
in Maestro.
Then you have
either,
like
is there?
younger version. What? Sorry.
But there isn't even in Maestro, which talks about a person who's bisexual.
There's more
like,
kissing in Maestro, at least. There's more kissing.
Maestro's different.
At
Well,
least he's not afraid of
Not
kissing
great,
a man. But I watched that short, and I'm like, okay, if this were made, I don't know, with Javier Bardem and Antonio Banderas in Spanish, I think they would go for it. They wouldn't be afraid. But I can totally see like Pedro Pascal being like, there's allegations against me. I don't want to confirm nor deny, so I'm not gonna be shown kissing a man, or touching him in sensual ways. It feels like that, and he's compromising. And what, like, love or hate Almodovar, he never compromised in his early films, for better or worse. And going to Hollywood, I'm like, he's starting to do it, and I'm not super big on that.
But that's not necessarily a caveat of Almodovar as a person. That's also an issue of the MPAA, which it's an NC-17 no matter what. Like, again, if you watch the documentary, Not Yet Rated, it goes into that. Like, it's a judicial system on Christian faith or religious zealots who look at it and want to represent America as an engrossing indoctrination of themselves rather than the actual public ideology that it proposes. But if you look at Parallel Mothers, granted, is more the dramatic sense that we were talking about earlier, but it's far more restrained in that he touches on queer relationships. He intertwines that in a story that feels somewhat authentic in that these two come together after a massive pain. It feels like there's at least a director then growing, and that's a Spanish back foundation, a funding, sorry, which was well received, I'd say, in Europe. I don't know if it translates well to the US, but I agree with you. Perhaps that 30 minutes is there just to showcase that he can get films out, because, you know, to be fair to him, and not to sound like a pariah here and to be like devil's advocate, but I do feel, again, back to your point about him not compromising, I'm all for that. Never compromise on your art, especially if you're trying to get queer representation on cinema, at least just a form of representation anyway. But in the same token, if you're going to try and do that and you're going to get an NC-17 in the US for showing gay sex on screen, you're fucked if you do and you're fucked if you don't. So I can understand why he pushes back on that and just does anything he wants. Because at the end of the day, his films won't play in rural Arkansas. You know, they just won't. And I don't think he's bothered by that. But I think it would be interesting to see these films be showcased. Granted, I'm not saying that there should be an argument to cut these films down, but it'd be interesting to see if he would compromise, at least to sort of get that queerness out there and get his image out there into more of a US territory. But again, I don't think he gives a shit about that. I think he was a queer kid that's come from a fascist regime. He's going to be a filmmaker, an incredibly popular, critically acclaimed filmmaker. I don't think he cares, and that's good. More fair play to you. But there's just something does linger in the back of my mind about, I wonder what you would have been like if you would have been born in Tennessee. Because I think that Spaniard in him, that hothead Spaniard about I'm putting anything I want, I like that. As a European, I'm all for that. But I do think it comes about in very strange ways of like, Pedro, you know, we're going to show an interaction of homoerotic sex on screen. Yeah, okay, I'm going to do it in a semi-rape way. Oh, Pedro, I know I know that, but let's perhaps no, I'm doing it that way, and because he has that ferociousness in me, like, this is my story, and you won't say anything about my story, which actually I think it's quite defendable. I appreciate that. I do think it's quite interesting to know that where he will draw the line in appropriation, or even just in sentimentality, or even just in fucking sentiments to begin with. Like, it's so interesting looking at him as a filmography. Like, I'm so excited to look back through this and see where he's compromised and where perhaps he's gone and like, I'm going for this. Because I think from what I've seen, I've been quite blessed in the fact that, well, it's been very compromised for a larger audience. I'll just say this then, because you say he doesn't compromise, right? I don't know if we all agree here. Do you think that sequence is imperative to the film, then, Nick? Yeah.
Yes and no. I genuinely
agree.
don't know. It's
No,
it's a cop out. I love my cop outs, you know, Carson. But yes, I don't know. I honestly genuinely don't know. That'd be interesting to see. You'd have to reshape it into a different scene to have like that kind of reveal. But also, it's like you said, Carson. It's just Spanish melodramas. That's how they work. Like, they're super hot. Like, I've seen more than I'd like to admit when I was growing up, because they were just like the thing on TV. Like, multiple television stations at lunchtime would have like 1 hour of those 10-minute soap operas. So it would be like 6-7 episodes one after the other. And even if when I was like House of Friends or whatever, you'd always have like the mother just be like, shh, it's 1 p.m. It's quiet, sitting down on the sofa. It's like time for my telenovela. And yeah, you know, they go in those uncomfortable directions, and it's so do we need it? We don't need it, but you can say that about so many scenes in so many movies. It's part of its identity, for better or worse. That's the best way I can put it.
I think that sequence is actually imperative for this film to work, in the fact that this is written by Ignacio, who is writing about his lover in a way, in a very sensual way, but also understanding that it won't be the same if they ever actually met, because he doesn't know if Enrique will have had the same life, or if what type of person Enrique actually is, if he's comfortable with his sexuality, he doesn't know. So it's interesting how he crafts that. And it's interesting that the first dynamic they have is a sexual one. Then it goes to a sensual one with him looking at it going, oh my God, he's got kids, and then putting the money in. Like, but if that sequence is then just left with just a kiss, an unconscious kiss, kissing him on the cheek or even on the lips to even some extent, and you have that nature of that Ignacio is going to leave Enrique once again, but at least he was there just in a very intimate moment. I think you get the same sensitivity there, and I think you even get the same sensuality. It's just very interesting that then he ups the he ups the game quite considerably, and then does what he does, because for me it loses the grasp of what that character is. Because if you actually think about it in the context of Enrique's story, Enrique's reading that, and that's the first time that's Ignacio writing about him. And granted, let's put it in perspective. This in context, this never actually happens. If we're actually correct about it, so I think you have to give him not an out, but I hold my hands up and say, well, it's, the act is a sensationalized one in a form of writing anyway, and maybe that's for us to become to have a conversation on. Well, not now, but obviously, I mean, as audiences. So again, you can sort of defend it there, but even within the film, it's Enrique's first understanding of Ignacio's adoration and sensuality upon Enrique, in that, like, that's what he after not seeing him in decades, that's the first thing he does. It's interesting. I'll say that. I think it's interesting, not to go into it yet. It's just interesting.
I think maybe moving to final thoughts on the film. I think we've broken down Bad Education quite a bit. I'll say after this conversation, I feel very mixed. I feel probably more mixed than I did walking in on this, as far as feeling strongly about the film. I do think there's a lot here. Nick, I think you make I really like a lot of what you said about the film and kind of revealing itself and what it's trying to say. I just think it's maybe the clearest example of a really worthy text being plagued by Almodóvar and his worst tendencies, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I like the film. I definitely am positive rather than I am negative. If I had to give a thumbs up or thumbs down, it would be a thumbs up. But it just isn't the film I think it could be, and I think that just makes me kind of disappointed in it. But I do think it is good overall, I guess is what I'll say.
I mean, I'll be very brief here. I'll echo exactly that. It's very interesting to have these conversations from three different perspectives. Carson, you're openly queer. Hopefully everyone knows that anyway. If you don't know Carson,
did you just out me to everyone?
Can you imagine if anyone's doesn't know who you are? No, our relationship, like, he's done what? But no, Carson is openly queer. It's very interesting to get representational conversation on that. Nick is incredibly European focused on cinema. I'm not. I'm not. In Almodóvar, then very much in the Almodóvar sphere. I'm not. I'm just entering that now. So it's interesting to break this down and see areas that I haven't seen, and then also discuss it. But I agree with Carson. I think the more you break this down, I do think it's going to be a very severe worry for a lot of this work. Is that it's interesting to look at the representation, hearing about what that representation means to other people, and also experiencing the film itself. I feel like two different separate issues of each film I'm watching with Almodóvar. I agree with Carson once again about it. I think this is a really good film in here, but it's just muddled, not very well executed, and at times often plagued by very strange decisions that feel like a consequence of ego from its director, more so that an elevation for its material itself, which I feel like is the biggest sin here on often occasions, in that the director is not allowing the actual film to speak for itself, rather than the radicalization of their ego and viewpoint. So it's definitely dropped from my estimations. I would also say that I do still like this, because I think there's tongue in cheek here. There's wonderful measurements of tone. There's a sensuality here. There's a wonderful sequence in a swimming pool that it just feels like weird to watch in a way that you feel that you're there. The sun's perfectly lit. The water feels crisp. There's body on screen with the skin, and he has all these things where they all meld together really well. He has a white background. He has the flooring of it's like this classic Spaniard aesthetic, and everything just punches with color, like you said earlier. Like everything is just wonderful notoriety with color. But then I just think about certain parts of it. I'm just like, this could be such a better, more influential, inflicting film. I think its ending is really impacting, bar its like last 5 fucking lines of text. But what I got out from this was a compelling feature. But I'm very I'm going to walk a very delicate edge with what we're gonna do next with Aldo Mavai. My personal thing, I don't know where I would go. I might hit the heights and then go to the smaller stuff. But as a first proper one, it's interesting to say the least, isn't it? It's very very thought provoking. Let's say.
Yeah, no, I'm a fan. I'm a fan. Even after this conversation, I kind of, weirdly enough, I kind of like the movie more.
Oh
Because some
God.
of the things that I wasn't, some of the things that just weren't clicking for me, just on an intellectual level, now they kind of click. Just trying to find reasoning behind it. So thank you guys. um, but no. I think it's a very complicated film, as we both talked about. We all talked about it for like 2 hours. There's a lot there, but I think there's a lot of good, especially when it comes to like everything about just art and emotions and catharsis and trauma, and just making sense of it. And it's messy, it's sloppy, almost in the way that like people in life are messy and sloppy. But I especially love when Almodovar just goes full cinema, when it's not about like people just talking, when he goes for like those cinematic moments. I think the one of the highlights comes very early for me. It's the Moon River sequence when the little kid is singing Moon
Oh
River, and you see
God.
like all the children just these beautiful shots of like water and just laughter and innocence and playfulness, and then like this child keeps on singing and the score just vanishes and you have this empty shot of bushes. Like, fuck me, pure cinema. That's and that's when you're like, yes, he has, like, what's the new thing, he has the juice. That's what they say now, right?
That's
You
what
can
they
see he
say.
has the juice. It just keeps on changing every 2 months. It's another term.
Well, if you want to watch Bad Education, as well as most of Pedro Almodóvar's films, they're not really streaming in America. I don't know about globally, but you can buy and rent them. Kind of, I don't know, maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing that they're not super accessible. I know some pop up on Criterion Channel here and there, so just do your best. But you can rent and
Put
buy
them on
them.
Netflix
Uh,
for everyone to
sure.
see.
I would love to see what the moms of Michigan think when they're like, "Oh, that's a cute comedy," and then they
The moms of
watch
Michigan, yeah.
women on the anything. For our question of the week, we're asking, because this film is obviously a large part of this is about the power of filmmaking. What's your favorite film about filmmaking? Which I think is a very fun and open-ended question. I didn't just want to ask what's your favorite Pedro film. A lot of directions you can go with. Nick, we'll start with you. What is your answer for your favorite film about filmmaking?
Sorry, Carson. I'm sorry. It's two picks. It's two picks. But for good reason, because one is just a movie that's it's kind of literally, but also primarily metaphorically about filmmaking that I really love. I'm David Lynch's boy. He's my man. He's my father, my brother, my sister, my uncle, my son. Um, I absolutely love Mulholland Drive. Inland Empire, I almost thought of putting that here, but Mulholland Drive is like the film for like just the emotional aspect of like making a movie in a more surreal way. It just captures it beautifully. The fear, the tension, the drama that goes on behind the scenes, and just how making movies and just living in the fiction of a film can make you cope with the darkness of reality. I think that's very moving. There's the Lynch Oz documentary that came out last year. Not a fan of it for the most part. I think it's all right, except for one essay by Karin Kusama who talks about Mulholland Drive, and she changes. You've seen it, right, Carson? She changes. She interprets the ending in like a positive light, and I found that to be a very interesting way. And I rewatched the movie with that perspective. I was like, yeah, I can kind of see that. I've always seen it as like an incredibly dark ending and very like pessimistic, but there is a way of seeing, just art helps us deal with a lot of things. And if living in our own fantasy where everything goes well and we actually get the girl is, the only thing that keeps us alive from and away from, offing ourselves, that's good. Then it can be good. But for like an actual movie that's like grounded in sort of reality that's about filmmaking, Francois Truffaut's Day for Night, it's So good, so good, super fun. He actually captures like the day to day of like how a big set works, and a little tidbit to connect it to Mulholland Drive. Francois Truffaut is present as an actor in the film, and he plays the director of the fiction film that they're shooting. And he has like an hearing aid problem, and he has to speak very loudly and shout, and he often misunderstands what people say, kind of like David Lynch in Twin Peaks. Coincidence? Probably not.
Nick, theoretically, if we had to do a podcast on a David Lynch film, which one would you choose for that?
No, you can't ask me that. Probably Mulholland Drive, I think, could be an interesting. Either that or Inland Empire could lead to some very
I haven't
thought-provoking
seen Inland
conversations.
Empire, so
I've never seen it either.
So if you want to do Inland
Interesting.
Empire, I'm fucking game for that.
I'll pencil it in. We'll figure out a place. Jack, what's your answer for the question?
Right, I have 4. I'm going to give you 2 answers for each, just because there's a reason why. I'll start with the more like rough ones here. The 2 rough ones, which are probably more R-rated, is Blowout and Boogie Nights. I just find them fascinating to look. Yeah, to look at the actual practicality of filmmaking as well. 2 very interesting subjects about making horror, but also making pornography. But the other 2 as well. That's sort of more of an adult-oriented thing. But there's 2 which I think are very important for the reason why they use filmmaking in the film. The first one is Super 8, and the second one is Hugo. So Super 8 is imperative, not only to get that 80s throwback of like the Spielberg or the Goonies nature and stuff like that, but also to showcase like kids going out there, using a Super 8 camera, but shooting a film with their friends. The accessibility now and doing it on an iPhone, I think it travels miles. It's also a fun film, but I love the fact that it's imperative to that sequence in itself in the film. I think Cloverfield would be an interesting one as well, but I'm not going to put Cloverfield in. The other one, which I think is vastly underrated, and for multiple reasons, but I think Martin Scorsese's Hugo did a two-factor thing with the film, in the fact that it showcases not only a really interesting power of filmmaking at such an imperative age within itself growing, and ultimately at its start with people becoming like intoxicated by it, but also giving the flowers to George Méliès, played by Ben Kingsley, who is the godfather of cinema. Without such, I think the influence is almost unattainable, even to discuss, to even give that context would be 4 or 5 hours worth of just massive amount of influence. And I think to interpret that as a child's film almost, within reason, and give a sense of education on that man, of also the impacting nature of his films, I think it's so genius and such a love letter to filmmaking. It's probably the most cinematic film about cinema on a massive global level, done by a master of his craft, a master of the craft, which is Scorsese. Out of the 2 of them, they're very similar, but I would probably have to give it Hugo. Like, honestly, it blows my mind that he managed to do that on them. I mean, he even released it in 3D. Like, come on, crazy stuff. But yeah, that it was a really hard touch, that, because I was going to go King Kong because I thought it'd be fun, but no, it wasn't. Or Borat, but I didn't. I didn't.
Yeah.
Yours would
There's
be
tons of good
interesting.
documentaries also.
Yeah.
Tons of great ideas. Hugo, I love Hugo. Everyone is like really acts like that film is like mid or like not that great. I don't know. It's like 5 stars for me.
Yeah,
I love
agreed.
it.
Yeah, agreed.
I always hate these because then you guys have such fun answers, and mine is going to be more recent. I'm not going to go too in depth because it's actually our next episode we're publishing. But Damien Chazelle's Babylon is a film I'm kind of stunned with. Every time I watch this film, I am more and more just blown away by what Damien Chazelle accomplishes, what it means for his career, looking at the Hollywood system, and these really big picture ideas, but also with these very close stories of diversity. Again, we'll talk about it more in depth. That's our next episode. But like, really, every time I watch Babylon, and I'll never forget the feeling of first watching it in the theater, but even revisiting it at home, it's just one of those I could throw on any day, anytime, and just kind of be like find more and more value each watch. So I'm very excited to talk about it because it is one of my favorites probably of
yeah.
all time, genuinely.
Oof.
And we didn't cover it on ClapperCast. We never did a Babylon episode for some reason. I think we were taking like a small month-long break.
I
So
don't
like,
think anyone watched
I'm excited
it
to
either,
finally
to be fair.
give it its flowers. That's also true, Jack. Yes. So with that, let's go to our rapid reviews. Films we've seen recently. Let's do this kind of quickly. Jack, what have you seen recently? Cut to your bones and all review finally, right?
No, don't even do that to me. I've been watching a lot of Jackie Chan films, like I said last week. I've been watching the end of the Police Story franchise, which just gets very strange. I watched I watched Armor of God, the trilogy, Operation Condor, and Chinese Zodiac. That was interesting. The Loveless Karen Bigelow. I watched what else did I see? I watched Marie Antoinette this morning because I was watching it to bill it with Priscilla, but I'd already seen Priscilla. But I just wanted to. I like to, if I'm going to watch a new film, if I can find a director that I haven't seen before, I like to double bill them. So I'm going to watch Christopher Bogley's. I'm fucking butchering that. Sick of Myself as well, just for the dream of scenario, and I'm going to do The Whale with Pi. I'm not looking forward to that. But that's all I've been really doing. I've been watching a lot of Jackie Chan movies. I've got a lot to review yet as well. I've got Eileen to do, Society of Snow. I'm going to go watch Poor Things and Godzilla -1 on Tuesday, which I'm looking for, and I'm going to watch Dogtooth to companion Poor Things, and then I'm going to, because I've done this, I'm going to have to do Bones and All for the next Sunday, and I'm going to try watch Bo Is Afraid, I promise, but I will watch Strange Way of Life if I can fit it in, and I might watch another Almodovar. I might watch a very controversial one from the beginning, from you guys' recommendation. I think that's all really. Next episode is going to be frightening with what I've seen, but we'll get into that next.
Sure. Nick, what have you seen recently?
Super quick, just 4 quick recommendations of what I've watched. The Dead by John Huston, his final movie, adaptation of James Joyce's short story. Just classy. Just class, man. Just pure class. And quick. Classy. It's like 80 minutes long. Started watching Decalogue, the 10-episode 10 Commandments of Krzysztof Kieślowski. First one is fucked me up. I was like, I'm gonna watch one a day, and I was like, if they're all like this, I'm just gonna kill myself by the end of it. So I'm watching like one every week or so. I was pacing myself out, just for my mental health. The Navigator, Buster Keaton, Carson's favorite, really enjoyed it. Blackface and portrayal of natives. But it's fun as far. It's lots of cute, cool, delightful.
Did you have to order it in that way where you said Carson's favorite? The one with blackface. Did you have to say that?
To be honest, like it's I can't think of many movies of the period where it's like there's not blackface. It's like, oh well, that Harold Lloyd. Well,
I love how he dodged the question as well, Carson. He completely dodged the question of what you said. He was like, yeah, well,
I apologize. I liked it.
It made him so nervous, you could tell.
No, I it's definitely a movie that's like, I think it's borderline perfect up until the last act. The last act was just like, I don't know, it's just way too long. I can definitely say I love Buster Keaton when he's like under an hour. I think like Sherlock Jr. and the others are like perfect. Sherlock Jr. is probably my favorite, which is super basic take. But and lastly, watch The Curse. It's finished. It's over. Final episode. Oh my Jesus! Have you seen it, Carson?
I have, yeah.
Fuck me. Oh. Just, oh.
It's out of this world, you could say.
Yes, it's very uplifting. So I would highly recommend it to people. Watch it.
That was a good one. I will say, if anyone wants my thoughts on Buster Keaton, we did a whole November. We did a Silent Showdown series here on the podcast where we compared him and Chaplin. I'm a Chaplin stan. I don't really like Buster Keaton.
So I prefer Chaplin, yeah.
Yeah, Chaplin's where it's at. I just watched one of his short films this week. But you can really break my viewing this week down into 3 categories. Pedro Almodóvar, which I'll say kind of mixed on most of them. Laws of Desire, pretty good, though I will say, for anyone who hasn't seen Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, didn't watch it this week. But also, Nick, I didn't realize at the time we have a John Couture connection between him and Almodóvar. So, like, that's, if you follow are screaming that no one watched those episodes, but like, you know what? It was meaningful for us. So I'm happy for that.
That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about.
Right. I've been working on this article for Clapper about gay porn, and I visited some Wakefield Pool films, specifically Boys in the Sand. I really love that film as an exploration of queer desire. I have a list on Letterboxd that is Carson Timar's personal canon, where it's just all the films that like really speak to me in this really deep way, whether it's a memory I have with them or something thematic within them. That film got added to that list this week, so I'm very happy for that. And then finally, because I've just like award season's over. I don't want to go watch all these new releases. I don't, Beekeeper. I'm sorry, Jakob, have it. I don't need it. So I have been going through the Letterbox list, top 250 films are like the most fans because it's just super popular
wow.
films that I haven't, and I can kind of see what I haven't seen. I'm not gonna lie, I've been kind of disappointed.
I'm not surprised. I've seen some
I
of those
look
lists. It's part of it. It's
well. I think I have unpopular opinions on some of them. I finally watched The Great Lebowski, and I loved the main character, hated the film. I thought it was the most annoying film. Had to turn it off.
fair.
It was awful. I was pretty mixed on. Well, I thought Superbad was fun. I did enjoy Superbad, which I watched off that list. I don't know. It's been kind of lost in translation. Sofia Coppola, I just don't think is my director. I really like. I don't know, and I know Jakob. I know
That
you worship
shocks
this
me.
film, and I know a lot of people love it. Every film of hers, I go in and I'm like, it's fine. She's a very like 3.5 star director for me, kind of like Pedro Almodóvar, where there are some that peek through. I think On the Rocks specifically is actually quite fantastic. I don't know. This one just was fine. So I don't know. Not to throw out bad opinions at the end here, but just not for me.
I'm shocked with the Coppola thing for you because I think of a director who's not only very feminine but looks and really showcases that story very interestingly. I'm surprised that Jakob is the stan and you're not in the sense of like queerness like that. But I think
Yeah.
Coppola is very soft in how she puts forward really difficult themes. I don't know if that's what you reject or not like that, but I'm shocked because I remember when I was watching like random shit and you were like, "This is a very strange." Last few reviews, I think you mentioned on one of my reviews, and I did the same for you, and I was like, "Percy Jackson thing, super bad." The Big Lebowski is like, I don't know what's going on. I may DM. I might just reach out, but now that makes sense. I'm glad. But yeah, the Coppola thing's like, oof. Have you seen everything of hers?
For her, not everything. I still need to see Marie Antoinette, and I think there's a couple more,
Somewhere?
but I've seen
Have you
most
seen
of her
Somewhere?
work. Yeah, I've seen
Okay.
Somewhere. A
Wow.
lot of it is just like I like the premise. I don't know. I guess I can kind of like specify on my thoughts of Priscilla, which is a lot of her films where she has a worthwhile thing to say and she says it in those first 10 minutes, and then you just kind of sit there and watch the characters reinforce it over. It's not engaging to me. I don't think it evolves necessarily. I think On the Rocks is one of her few films where like it actually evolves in statement, it actually grows. I think it's just a lot of meandering, not really saying a lot, or rather saying a lot but saying the same thing over and over again that just bores me.
She's
I
a
don't know, it's
vibes
just not my
filmmaker.
filmmaker. Yeah, it's
Pure
just
vibes,
not
yeah.
for me.
I
Respect everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I think she's evolved into that because I think that's just how she is now where she's in her life. I think that's definitely it. I've just from someone who's watched Marie Antoinette, um, the fact that that's like her third film, and what she does there to
Crazy.
showcase a teenager to become an adult in the space of 2 hours and do it in a certain way where everything's color, but then have like this gleam and their underbelly is like really quite scary. I think you'll vibe with that. I mean, if you've not liked anything else, I'm not going to put money on it or anything like that, but
I actually think I will. My prediction is I'm going to like that one. Like I fully expect
so
to like
too.
it, and it's not that I hate her work. Like I think The Bling Ring is fun. Like I think it's good. It's just not one of my like favorites. But
I think she changed,
which is
the
the case for a
Ring.
lot of people.
Yeah, I think she changed after The Bling Ring because I think even The Beguiled is a very slow, very cold, hollow film. I think it's a masterpiece in its own right. But she definitely changed tune after The Bling Ring in 2013, and then made very much highbrow, sophisticated cinema. Because she was very tongue in cheek how she made films in like the after Lost in Translation. Even that, like she aims at Spike Jonze in it, but it's like really having a developing relationship, wonderful score, quite a fun film. And then she does again Marie Antoinette, and then again she does Somewhere as well between then, and then she does The Bling Ring. I think there's something in between there as well. It's interesting like what happened to because I think she just had oh God, this is gonna sound terrible, but I think she just had a life and it just changed her viewpoint really interestingly. Like it does a lot of people. I just find it fascinating. if you watch that in context of watching someone evolve, it's like perfectly, like it resembles someone who just like saw things in a different life once he got to a point of like having children or like just sort of like, I always want to make what I want to do now. Because the Bling Ring, when you watch fucking Priscilla, is like, whoa. I don't know. Maybe it's like the 2013 and then the 2023. Like it's fascinating to me. But anyway, I don't mean to derail it. I just thought that's fascinating.
I think she screams a filmmaker who, as she goes forward, starts to like, how do I say this like respectfully? She starts to like really buy into, I feel like, her own weight and hype of her films. There's a difference there between like, I feel like Priscilla, I kind of like, I don't know, I'm happy we didn't do a Priscilla episode, but there's so much talk about that film as far as like a developmental standpoint. She watched Elvis and was like, I have to tell this story. And she rushed that out as like a reaction piece, which I think is like wild to do. But I feel like that's very telling, the fact that she felt like she had to enter production. She had to bring the story to life as like putting that on her shoulders. I don't know. I just feel like it's very interesting, but that's just me.
Yeah, the same thing happened to her father as well, if he wanted to go there, but we're not going to. But the same thing happened to Mr. Coppola as well.
2026, Sofia Coppola retrospective.
Go buy his wine though, because we do need to have that film come out. So go buy his wine. Let's fund.
It's funny you say that, because I'm going to start having drinks on Uncut Gems now, because it really did fuck me up on Friday. So speaking of wine, I'm going to have to get. I'll check the price on Amazon and I'll try and get a bottle.
Get the sampling one. I know there's like a kit of like 6 or 7 wines, and you can combine them to like a movie and watch them together. So,
I don't know. I think if I started drinking wine on this, I'd enjoy it. I'd say some things I shouldn't say, and I think I'd start enjoying myself, like to a point where like we're very open with each other on here, but like once a bottle of wine goes in red, it's like maybe we would have to get the bleep machine. Anyway, just go on, Carson, before anyone starts saying anything.
Yeah, well, before we get into where we're going to get a lawsuit, let's find where we can find each other on social media. Nick?
You can find me avoiding lawsuits on Twitter and Instagram at NikiGra97, and you can watch my short films and videos on YouTube and Vimeo at Enjoy the Movies. And of course, all the writings on Clapper, the posts on Clapper's Instagram, Clapper LTD, just good stuff.
Not to put Nick over, but like if you've not watched his short films that he mentions every episode, you really should go watch them, because I promise you, like, they're genuinely good. Believe me, I've had friends, I've had people on this very podcast try to be like, go watch my short film, and like they're not good, and you have to be like, yeah, like, okay, they're good, go watch them, you give them a heart on Letterboxd. But like Nick's films are good. I would recommend you go see them if you've not already. Like, I don't know, they're worth a while actually, which you can't say about everyone. Jack, where can we find you on social media?
Well, you can also find me avoiding libel lawsuits on Twitter and Clapper and Letterboxd, so the username at Jak-Luke Sharp. And I'll also go again. Nick, you've been my friend from probably almost a decade now. I think you've got a wonderful texture as a filmmaker, and the fact that you want to do a PhD and not make a feature film really makes me annoyed. But more to you. But I do also second that every time I can share it, every time I can show them. Go watch stuff. Go watch The Phantom Touch. Realize him as a filmmaker. Give him the push that he needs to go make a feature film. Max out those credit cards, Nick. Come on.
Working hard.
It's actually like it's actually a shame. I don't know if people can go watch Phantom Touch, but to watch that and be like, there's not a feature film like career of this guy and go watch, like, is annoying. I'm not gonna lie. So I would love for you to go do that. Go ruin your life. Don't do the PhD.
I'm probably going to ruin my life later this year. I started pre-production officially in a short film, contacted actors, first draft of the script is ready, It's going to be a horror romance. Very graphic. Just know that.
Well,
I don't know, it's verging into like Cronenberg and Julia Ducournau territory, so it's going to be dangerous in that sense. It's not going to be for everyone. You can show it to my grandparents.
Yeah, from an Italian filmmaker, that frightens me a lot.
I'm European. That's what you said. Deeply European.
Yeah.
I used to be able to say that.
You can find. Go for it.
No, I'm going to a Brexit thing. I used to be able to say that. Now I'm just English, which is just disappointing. But
yeah. You can find me on Twitter at BP_movie reviews, Letterboxd Carson Timar, and Blue Sky Carson Timar, I guess, though there's really no reason to follow me there. Thank you so much for listening and watching. This was a fun episode, 2.5 hours on Almodóvar. Hopefully, Pedro, I'm sorry that it really wasn't a celebration, but you know what? That's fine. We'll see you back in 2 weeks when we discuss Damien Chazelle's Babylon as the start of my birthday series. So we'll see you then. Goodbye.